1.
Listening to Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from across the divided states of America, it is time now for another edition of the most disruptive show covering every side of political events, politics, events, and more across our country as well as across our globe. In the independent corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, a burning ember in the darkness, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together we are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right, I hope everybody is having a good morning this morning. Let's get into headlines. First up, in COVID news, at least 2,315 new coronavirus deaths and 71,737 new cases were reported in the U.S. yesterday. Over the past week, there has been an average of 68,029 cases per day. That's a decrease of 37% from the average 2 weeks earlier. And as of this morning, more than 28,279,000 people in the U.S. have been infected with the coronavirus, while more than 2,300 have died from it. Ghana has become the first country in the world to receive vaccines acquired through the United Nations-backed COVAX initiative. The vaccine delivered by UNICEF arrived at Accra's Kotoka International Airport early Wednesday and are part of the first wave of COVID-19 vaccines that COVAX is sending to several low and middle-income countries. Ghana's vaccination campaign will begin March 2nd and will be conducted in phases among prioritized groups, beginning with health workers, adults of 60 years and over, people with underlying health conditions, frontline executive, legislature, judiciary, and their staff. In national political news, back in the States here, the House is expected to approve President Biden's $1.9 trillion coronavirus relief proposal later this week. The bill includes $1,400 stimulus checks, extra money for vaccine distribution, and funding to state and local governments. It was approved by the Budget Committee on Monday by a vote of 19 to 16. Senate Democratic and Republican staffers are expected to meet with the parliamentarians this week to make their arguments for and against the minimum wage provision. Not sure about that. That word. Anyway, Jamarl, what do you think about this? Do you think this is going through? Too little, too late is one argument for it, but what do you think?
Yeah, I think it's going through. I mean, they have the votes for it. And look, it should go through. And you know what? Further, beyond this going through, there are apparently other plans that these guys are planning to push through also. A plan on infrastructure and a plan on something else. In the media, they were saying that Bernie Sanders turned to somebody and says, "This is Mr. Reconciliation." And making the point that they're talking about like 3 major spending bills that they're planning on using reconciliation to pass. So, yeah, they're serious about it. They're serious about it. Now, if they can get everybody on the same page is a question. But they have big plans. So we'll see what happens.
All right, we'll come back to that. President Joe Biden held his first bilateral virtual meeting with Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau on Tuesday, yesterday. The two world leaders unveiled a U.S.-Canada partnership roadmap detailing their commitment on issues like combating COVID-19, tackling the climate crisis, bolstering continental defense, and strengthening global alliances. Trudeau and Biden both delivered televised statements on their partnership, but did not hold a traditional joint press conference. Biden has yet to hold a press conference as president. Unlike Trump, who was just doing them constantly during the heyday there, I remember that. The United States is seeking election to the United Nations Human Rights Council 3 years after former President Donald Trump's administration withdrew from it. Secretary of State Antony Blinken has stated, quote, "I'm pleased to announce the U.S. will seek election to the Human Rights Council for the 2022 to 2024 term. Earlier this year, Blinken said that, quote, "To address the council's deficiencies and ensure it lives up to its mandate, the United States must be at the table using the full weight of our diplomatic leadership, end quote. Currently, the membership includes China, Russia, and Venezuela, along with Cuba, Cameroon, Eritrea, and the Philippines. In international news, Britain on Tuesday granted the European Union 2 extra months to approve their bilateral trade deal that sets out relations in the wake of Brexit. The deal was set to be fully signed and sealed by both sides by the end of this month, but the EU asked for an extension. The agreement was stuck on Christmas Eve last year, just a week before the Brexit transition period expired. Britain's parliament approved it in late December. A note from the British government reads, quote, "It is disappointing the EU has not completed its internal processes in the agreed time frame, given the uncertainty it creates for businesses and individually on both sides," end quote. In Germany, a court on Wednesday sentenced an Iraqi preacher to more than 10 years in prison for planning an attack on Germany and collecting funding and doing recruitment for the Islamic State. Prosecutors accused him of recruiting at least 7 individuals, including 2 who are believed to have killed over 150 Iraqi soldiers in suicide bombings. He was sentenced to 10.5 years in prison, while some of the men he recruited were sentenced to between 4 and 8 years in prison. I would kind of think you'd get more than that, to be honest. I mean, that's a decade. But if you're recruiting people who are killing hundreds of people, to like one of the major adversaries of the West as such or whatever, to a major terrorist group, the Islamic State, I just feel like, I don't know, I'm backwards in some sense on this one. But in Niger, Mohamed Bazoum, who has won the presidential election, which has been hailed as the first democratic transition in the country. He took 55.75% of the vote against opposition candidate Mohamed Ousmane. Supporters of Mr. Ousmane, a former president, have protested in the streets, alleging fraud in that election. Bazoum is set to succeed President Mahamadou Issoufou, who is stepping down after 2 5-year terms. In Georgia, thousands of anti-government protesters rallied outside the parliament building in central Tbilisi on Tuesday after the arrest of opposition leader Nika Melia. Protesters gathered to denounce Melia's arrest and demand early elections. Georgia has been in the grip of a political crisis since parliamentary elections in October, which opposition parties slammed as rigged after the Georgian Dream Party, claimed a narrow victory. Irakli Kobakidze, chairman of the ruling Georgian Dream Party, has defended the police raid, stating, quote, "Polarization is a result of criminals being in politics, not of so-called politicians being in jail," end quote. Georgia's new prime minister, Irakli Garibashvili, who was confirmed by Parliament on Monday, has said in a statement to lawmakers that Melia will, quote, "not manage to hide from justice," end quote. The U.S. Embassy in Georgia has stated that it was, quote, "deeply concerned by the government's decision to detain the head of a major opposition political party," end quote. In tech news, Sweden and Denmark are both reviewing copyright laws that may force digital platforms to pay media sites for the ability to share news content. The proposal is intended to grant publishers and media companies the right to demand compensation whenever their journalism is circulated on digital platforms. Swedish Justice Ministry legal expert Patrick Sundsberg has said that the goal of the legislation is to regulate the relationship between media companies and IT companies and strengthen the position of online newspaper publishers by giving them exclusive rights to their publications. Similar legislation is being prepared in Denmark, whose culture minister Joy Mogensen questioned the quote-unquote democratic mindset of digital companies that block media who demand payment for sharing their content, which Facebook recently did in Australia. The ban has since been lifted. Facebook's top manager in Scandinavia, Martin Ruby, called the proposal unfair, quote-unquote, claiming that Facebook also creates value for the media, though currently only 4% of Facebook content is news. Mogensen believes that failure to comply and losing quality news content will result in Facebook, quote, quickly becoming a place for tinfoil hats and conspiracy theorists, end quote, and falling in value. And I mean, in some sense, he's right, but I feel like it does flow both ways. The point about Facebook and other social media platforms serving to spread news media content, that's 100% true. If you look at what led to the decline in the value of the newspaper and just the profitability of various media outlets, there are different ways that you can cut those joints. There are different ways that you can slice it up. But part of it is that with the internet in general, not with social media companies and social media platforms in particular, but just with the promises of this relatively new technology platform that we're all using to share information and content, quote unquote, it makes writing and sharing things a lot easier, and it makes it more accessible so that you don't need to be credentialed into a position where your words are going to get published in a relatively expensive to produce print newspaper or magazine or whatever, you know. So anybody can start writing on a blog for free, and that obviously predates social media platforms. That predates Facebook and Twitter and all these things. And I would say that that's what started the decline, if anything. And you have at the same time increasing corporate ownership of not only TV stations but major newspapers across the country. And so there's this weird confluence of forces that I still don't think we fully understand. Where on the one hand, we lost trust in establishment media, and we're continuing to lose trust in it. And on the other hand, you had the rise of alternative media through like its democratization online. And when you get both of those things together, you get people paying less attention to the older outlets, and certainly paying them less money. And then, of course, if you were a company that was hoping to transition to like an online platform and thinking that you could keep charging people for articles, well, if everybody gets used to reading blogs for free, and if they're constantly trying to find ways to read your content for free, what do? Do you really lock it down? That becomes a less and less profitable choice over time. People are just not used to paying for a newspaper subscription anymore, and for good reason, when they have access to all that same content for free online. Now, maybe, epistemological standards in journalism have fallen over the years. I don't know, Jamarl. I've gone all over the place here. What's your take on that?
So a few things. I do think Facebook adds value to it. I mean, think of how many people see a particular media story because the media story is on Facebook. Like, you could see news basically the moment something happens, you see it online. And you can have people who say, "Oh, I like that story." They pass the story around, and that story bubbles up in a way that would not exist were it not for Facebook, Twitter, and some of the other social media companies. Meaning, yes, I understand that, because newspapers are basically taking it in the throat because of the way social media has basically proliferated. It's a disruptive technology on that front. By the same token, it is also spreading their news in a way that they would never get had it not been for Facebook and Twitter and social media. I mean, that's what I think. I think that's a true statement, right? So I don't think that's false at all. And I think we all benefit from it in some way. Because like I said, something can happen at any particular point in the world and we are aware of it. And when it's bad things that happen and you have this kind of social pressure that's affected by social media and by the world knowing the sins of some other country that we wouldn't have otherwise known were it not for that social media picking up a news story in a particular area that otherwise would be ignored. So yeah, I mean, the question becomes, should Facebook have to pay for that since their entire business model is basically based off of other people's information? Like, honestly. And Twitter, same thing. The entire business model, YouTube's entire business model is based off just other people's information. It's a platform for it. People like to use it, yes. But should they compensate other organizations for creating the stuff that they use to basically profit off? I mean, I think all of these are questions. You know what I mean?
I hear you, but you can turn the table. Should news outlets be charged by Facebook for sharing their content for free, for distributing and giving it basically free advertising, letting people distribute it for free, getting it across the board, and bringing people into those news outlets pipelines where they're going to get more subscribers over time if their content is good enough. I mean, you could spin it the other way too.
Right.
So right?
But that's kind of where I get at, and people are attacking me for it. Because my thing was, look, each of these companies each of these groups comes out with their purview. My point of view is this, and they say my point of view is that, and they're going to say a point of view that is basically in their self-interest. Of course they're going to do that. And so whatever Facebook can do by hook or by crook that's going to allow them to keep a red cent in their pocket, they're going to do it. And that's the argument they're going to make. The governments are going to make a counter argument that basically says, no, we're going to get that red cent because we want to prop up media. And by the way, government has a point on that. I mean, if you need journalism, you're not going to get it on Facebook. You're going to get it through the newspapers and those have been starved. And by the way, that also makes them more susceptible to needing advertiser dollars, which affects the content. So there's an argument to be made here on both sides for this. So it's an interesting thing for these guys to find out. It really is.
It is, yeah. You know what? There's a lot more to talk. It's an interesting conversation. We keep coming back to it, and I kind of didn't anticipate us doing that. We got a couple more headlines to get to. In Earth and Science news, an American Airlines passenger jet traveling from Cincinnati to Phoenix allegedly encountered a UFO over northeastern New Mexico Sunday afternoon. The pilot on flight 2292, radioed around 1 p.m. CST that the UFO was flying right on top of them, quote unquote. American Airlines has since confirmed that the radio transmission is authentic, but did not give any further comment on the encounter. An American Airlines spokesperson said in a statement that, quote, following a debrief with our flight crew and additional information received, we can confirm this radio transmission was from American Airlines Flight 2292 on February 21st. For any additional questions on this, we encourage you to reach out to the FBI, end quote. And real quick, last headline here. I hear you laughing, Jamarl. In business news, rapper Bobby Shmurda, his real name is Akil Gene Pollard, was released from jail on Tuesday after doing 6 years of a 7-year sentence for conspiracy and weapons possession. Shmurda was originally arrested back in December 2014 alongside several of his GS9 crew, including rapper Rowdy Rebel, on conspiracy to murder, weapons possession, and reckless endangerment charges. Shmurda ultimately took a plea deal for 4th-degree conspiracy and 2nd-degree criminal weapons possession charges, which resulted in the 7-year sentence. He was denied parole in September 2020 and was originally ordered to serve his maximum sentence, which would have kept him incarcerated until December 11th, 2021. He will remain on parole until 2026. And with that, those are headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We're going into a break. We'll be back in a minute with our soapbox segment and a short conversation back and forth. Be right back on the other side of the short break.
Fault Lines. We are talking
24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
You are listening.
We give you the most essential out of the endless information space.
Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Are you bored? Are you lonely? Do you need a hug? Well, we can't give you that, but we can keep you up to date on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio or video. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can send a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement makes this show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. Meghan McCain wants Fauci fired. She was very clear about it, unequivocal, full-throated, and she made a statement about this on The View. Now, the interesting part about this is, under normal circumstances, she often gets ridiculed, and this statement was no different. It was somewhat of a knee-jerk reaction that the left and people who don't particularly like her actually just happens. It shouldn't happen on this one. Tucked within this, even though some of this was kind of funny, some of this can't necessarily be defended, and even though she didn't necessarily flesh it out, there is a point that she is making here. And I got to be honest, it's actually a pretty good point. I don't necessarily agree with the notion of firing Fauci, but I do agree with the point that she's trying to make. So let's play the clip, and let's talk about the clip afterwards. Please.
The fact that I, Meghan McCain, co-host of The View, I don't know when or how I will be able to get a vaccine because the rollout for my age range and my health is so nebulous. I have no idea when and how I can get it. I want to get it. If you call me at 3 o'clock in the morning, I will go any place at any time to get it. I want to be responsible and obviously wait my turn. But this rollout has been a disaster. And I understand, obviously, President Trump can take much of the blame. But now we're in the Biden administration. I, for one, would like something to look forward to and to hope for, because if getting the vaccine means that just nothing changes and we have to wait another few years till everyone gets it, there's already a lot of people not getting it. We're already having a messaging problem getting people to take this vaccine. So I'm over Dr. Fauci. I think we need to have more people giving more opinions. And I honestly, quite frankly, I think the Biden administration should remove him and put someone else in place that maybe does understand science or can talk to other countries about how we can be more like these places that are doing this successfully.
Finding somebody who understands science, that's a low blow. And it's funny, and I got to be honest, it doesn't necessarily apply. Can't stand by that one. Also, just as a heads up, maybe you shouldn't start with Meghan McCain, because it comes across, co-host of The View, because it comes across as a certain degree of self-important. Me, used to do software engineering. I used to love doing software engineering. And you're talking about pride in my job. Yes, infinite pride. Because I built civilizations. I was one of the people, through my code and through the way that the process flowed to place. You had a problem, I was the guy that solved it from a computer programming standpoint, database, and middleware. I was your guy. If it wasn't for us, society will come to a halt. We are the ones that propagate society. And we build society. We are an indispensable component of that society. That's the way I felt about myself. But that is somewhat of a real assessment because we were indispensable. I hate to tell you this, you're just on television and you're just wearing the name of somebody who was famous. If you vanished tomorrow, let's say you were abducted by aliens, people would miss you for a day and then they would move on with another white woman with or without the famous name at the end. That is brutal, but I'm trying to put it in perspective. That's probably not where you want to start. To move further, she does have a point. Now, regardless of wearing masks or regarding the wearing a mask and the various restrictions of businesses, there's a gray area of subjectivity involving risk. An increasingly vaccinated population risk should conceptually dwindle as the number of people dying and getting infected also dwindles. With a rapid changing situation, how do you calculate risk associated with the virus? And just as important, when does that risk decrease to the point where the level of restriction becomes overbearing? When do the negatives of economic and individual restrictions outweigh the dwindling positives of seclusion? Dwindling because the potency of seclusion was in lowering the chance of spreading the infection. If vaccines offer immunity, then the value of seclusion, especially for people who are getting vaccinated, diminish by some intangible factor the more people that get vaccinated. You've taken a course to remedy the virus. The numbers are precipitously falling, and your population is in a process of more vaccinations. How do you get back to quote-unquote normal without ruining the progress? And if possible, speed that process along has to be the question. In fact, you can make an argument that for Joe Biden, that has to be the main question. Your science advisors could weigh in, but the decision is larger and includes more variables than it did when 5,000 people were dying a day. As far as I can tell, this is a valid point. You must understand, Americans have a tendency to be selfish, individualistic. We don't think we are, but we are rabidly individualistic. As long as the chances of getting ill were shared, the preponderance of the population, all of which were vulnerable together, agreed to the plan of seclusion. You had 70% of people saying, yes, fair enough, we'll stay in our homes. However, the more people that get vaccinated, the less unity will remain on the agreement of social distancing. The less people that will be in the camp of vulnerability, by definition, means that more are not vulnerable. The skew towards invincibility would create greater pressure to eliminate the restrictions, especially with the pressure built over the time that people have been locked in their homes. Fauci clearly knows science, But the truth is, his job diminishes as the virus diminishes. He knows he's a public figure and will be conservative on estimates because he doesn't necessarily want to be wrong. By the same token, he's getting to be somewhat grim. Let's play this clip of Fauci.
You think Americans will still be wearing masks, for example, in 2022?
You know, I think it is possible that that's the case. As we get into the fall and the winter by the end of the year, I agree with the president completely that we will be approaching a degree of normality. It may or may not be precisely the way it was in November of 2019, but it'll be much, much better.
Do you know how depressing that is? That despite the fact that the vaccines are rolling out, despite the fact that you're going to have maybe the overwhelming majority of the population vaccinated by the end of the year, depending on the ramp up and everything else, he is still saying that people would have to go out and wear masks, or that the restrictions are somehow going to still be in play next year, in a whole nother year. On a recent webcast, Fauci told a 91-year-old California woman that asks about resuming her Meghan game with her vaccinated friends, hey, that's a very logical question, but hang on. Because he was expecting updates from the CDC. Apparently, the issue that they're having is they don't entirely know whether or not a person who is vaccinated but has the virus could transmit that virus. But I got to tell you, that is an unsatisfactory response. We have ships on Mars right now, and you're telling me that we can't get the vaccines ramped up of sufficient quantity where people aren't going to be in their homes until next year, or at the very least, with these restrictions going on to next year. I'm not going to hate on Meghan for this, because I do think she has a point buried in these 2 minutes. I don't know what the sweet spot is to avoid a resurgence of the virus. I do know there comes a point at which the risk decreases. The restrictions to movement, the wearing of the mask, the restrictions on businesses become too onerous and more deleterious than the chances of catching the virus itself. That is a political question. That is somewhat subjective. And on that point, yes, I agree with her. Shane, what do you think about this? I mean, I don't agree with the firing Fauci thing, but I do think that at a certain point, rational, obvious. I mean, despite Godman Fauci and his proclamations and the way that mainstream media deals with him at this point. But the fact of the matter is, Fauci's job diminishes as the virus diminishes and as people get better. We don't have 5,000 people dying every day. So this notion of Fauci, being the entire decision maker seems farcical at a certain point. It has to get to a point where basically the number of people that would get sick, the potential issue of risk, what risk even means in that context, all of that stuff gets put up for question and becomes a political question at that. How much risk do your society want to deal with? And with the number of people vaccinated, I'm telling you, those people are not going to want to be stuck in their homes when the entire point of them getting vaccinated was to get out of their homes. People may not like McCain, and they may be joking her, but on this, deep in that, even though she didn't flesh it out, she does have a point. This is a political choice. What's your thought, Shane?
So for one thing, she's trying to curry favor with Trump Republicans who probably would be pissed at her for how she treated Trump. But by pushing back against Fauci, my guess is she's appealing to that base. She's making that move, whether it's heartfelt or not. It's clearly a political move. That's point one. Point two is, and we were talking about this off the air the other day when we were talking about this specific story, I think that what Fauci is doing, and if you look at this from a public health official standpoint, whether it's COVID or whether it's any airborne infectious disease, if you're wearing a mask and it works and you keep it clean, et cetera, you don't touch it too often, you're going to reduce the rate of spread of various diseases. And this is part of why in East Asia and Southeast Asia, mask use is prevalent. It wasn't just a response to the SARS crisis. It was also picked up as a general public health strategy by the public. And, for random people, I'm sure mask use is going to be way, way, way more prevalent going forward in the coming years and decades than it was before. I don't think it's going to be nearly as ubiquitous as it is right now if we can get a handle on this thing pretty soon, which of course we show all signs of doing. But it will be more ubiquitous simply because people will want to protect themselves, and it's a relatively cheap way to protect yourself, keep yourself from getting sick out in public. But from the public health official standpoint, my guess is, and this is speculation, my guess is they want to encourage mask use to reduce overall incidence of all infectious diseases, all airborne infectious diseases in the public. Now, my problem with that is if that's their goal, they should be doing it in a bit more straightforward of a way. They should have more respect for people than to, make it about one thing when really it's about many, many other things at the same time. You're right that a lot of people who are getting the vaccine are getting it and are happy to be getting it with the idea that not just that they won't get, as sick as they would if they get COVID without the vaccine, all that stuff. It's that they want to get back out to doing stuff, whether it's traveling or going out to eat more often or going to whatever public gatherings remain in the wake of this crisis. When we get those things going on a larger scale again, people are excited about getting back out. And frankly, I am too, maybe on a slightly more limited scale, because I was already kind of a homebody anyway. But I want to get out and be outside again, and not just outside, but like hanging out with other people. That sounds great. Going to parties occasionally. That sounds good, So for a lot of people, this is going to be like, wait, what? We've been in this for years, and you still want me to wear masks? Do you want me to socially distance too? Is that where we're going to be in 2022? And I think if he were to push that, if other public health officials were to push that, they would quickly become massively unpopular going forward, and that will be its own conversation. When exactly is the cutoff line? At which point we can say, okay, this crisis is over. We can basically return to whatever new normal we're going to create here. We need to go into a break. This is going to be an ongoing conversation over the coming months, I'm sure, as we we reach a weird inflection point where it's like, okay, have we beat this thing? We're definitely not there yet, though, but we'll be back on the other side of this break. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Be right back.
Fault Lines.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Want to know how international issues fit into local ones and how local issues fit into international ones with the historical context to tie them together? Well, we're bringing it to you all by any means necessary. Tune in weekdays from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time to hear me, Jackie Lukman, alongside my co-host Sean Blackman. By any means necessary, your guide to connecting the social, political, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. There's interesting news dealing with the Iran working with coming up with a temporary deal with the IAEA, basically because the JCPOA was shot dead by the United States, and they're trying to find ways to keep an eye on the nuclear refinement. Well, I want to get to that, but there's a more important story that I kind of want to get to first. We at this channel like to point out issues of hypocrisy. Love to point out issues of hypocrisy, especially on these kind of American or Western perspective of things that don't necessarily line up with actual reality when you drag out to be a larger context. So, The Guardian, Iranian officials should be charged over shooting down of Ukrainian plane, UN expert says. And it starts, many high-level Iranian officials should be charged for the shooting down of a Ukrainian commercial airliner in January 2020, a UN human rights expert has said, describing the killing of 176 people aboard profound and serious indictment of the country's civil and military authorities. That is amazing, because when Soleimani was murdered, nobody said anything. And more importantly, the U.S. has shot down its own airplane. Right here, this is Newsweek. Less than 2 months later, on July 3rd, 1988, Aegis armed guided missile cruiser USS Vicinus, I suppose that's called, opened fire on what the crew would later claim they thought to be an attack on an Iranian F-14 fighter jet. Instead, the aircraft was an Iranian Flight 655, a Dubai-bound civilian Airbus A300 and 290 people on board, all of whom were killed. Our response was, America doesn't apologize. And my point is, it's amazing the way there's this kind of two-sided way of looking at this stuff. It's one thing if you want to say the Iranians should be charged, then by the same token, you should say that the United States should be charged for the things it's doing. And that doesn't necessarily seem to be the case. Joining us to discuss is Laith Maroof, an award-winning multimedia producer and broadcast law consultant. Laith, welcome to the show, man. How's it going today?
Great. Thank you for having me again, guys.
Absolutely. So you were posting about this particular article from The Guardian, and you were making the point that they murdered Soleimani. They murdered, I think it was there was another gentleman that was with Soleimani when he died, the Quds Force leader.
Commander Al-Mohandes.
Exactly. And also the scientists that were being killed.
Was it? Yeah, Mohsen Fakhrizadeh.
Yeah, none of these things seem to rise to the level of requiring charges. And yet, here we are. I mean, and honestly, even the JCPOA thing kind of fits into this, because the Biden administration or the people, the media in this country, is going to conveniently forget that the U.S. is the one that pulled out of the JCPOA if it's beneficial to the Biden administration. Mark my words, that's exactly what they're going to do. So how do you view this? Because this is aggravating to me. I hate it when they drop context like this, because I think it gives a skewed view of our world. But how do you feel about this?
This is a UN special rapporteur on extrajudicial summary or arbitrary execution. So basically, her file is to address this kind of incidents in the world. And what falls under this kind of incident is the assassination of General Soleimani of Iran and Commander Al-Mohandes of Iraq on Iraqi soil in the airport, an international civilian airport, in the airport of Baghdad a year ago. So instead of this United Nations special rapporteur addressing that, she decided to address the follow-up incident that happened a month later, the downing of the Ukrainian civilian airline over Tehran airspace. And if you remember, this is where it's the ridiculousness compounds. General Soleimani was lured to Baghdad by Trump through contact with the president at the time of Iraq, Abdel Hadi Mahdi, who Trump asked him to invite Soleimani to begin negotiations on ways for the United States and Iran to de-escalate. And so here is Soleimani arriving at the airport of Baghdad under invitation by the Americans and the Iraqis.
To de-escalate.
To de-escalate.
And then he gets assassinated. Yes. That is insane.
Yes.
Go for it, Laith. I just wanted to interject to sort of add an exclamation to that.
Yes. So this is the most treacherous kind of behavior that humanity has known, killing the messenger. We have a proverb about it. This is how important this concept is of guaranteeing the safety of messengers between peoples is to humanity as a whole. And he gets assassinated by the United States in an arbitrary execution, a summary execution, extrajudicial execution. And in retaliation, Iran, obviously a month later, bombed the 2 American bases in Iraq, destroying the command centers of the Ain al-Assad base, occupation base in Iraq. And during this retaliation of Iran, the United States attempted to actually bomb Iran. The F-35s and other bombers were flying towards Iran when they were caught by Iranian air defenses and radars, which they didn't expect the Americans. And as a response, the United States attempted to hack the Iranian radars and air defenses. They couldn't shut them down, but what they were able to do is scramble the what the Iranians see, and this is where the confusion becomes. This is one tactic that states that you do electronic warfare do if they can't shut down a radar system of their enemy. They make all the targets on the radar scrambled. So instead of seeing a civilian airliner, the Ukrainian airliner, the Iranian air defense unit saw missiles, and this is just in order to extract the F-35s that were heading towards Iran, that were going to be shut down by the air defenses. This is what the United States did, and we ended up having this unfortunate accident. And the UN Repertoire on Extrajudicial Summary and Arbitrary Execution decides that she's going to take on the Iranian officials for this accidental downing of a civilian airline, but doesn't open her mouth on the actual extrajudicial summary and arbitrary execution of Soleimani and al-Mohandes.
Yeah, that's very, very, very weird. Pompeo, on that attack, we should always remember, said it was done because it was an imminent attack planned by Soleimani. Now, again, we need to keep in context that he was there under the guise of peace talks and to bring down tension when he was basically murdered and executed in this particular fashion, or assassinated in this particular fashion. And even though Pompeo said it was imminent, he said he didn't know when. Now think about that. It's imminent, which is a time component, meaning it's something that's going to take place in a short span of time. And yet he doesn't necessarily know when the attack was going to take place. I do want to get to something that you said, though. Is that the research on that? I mean, how do you know that it was the jamming that caused it to hit the plane? Is that something that has been verified in the research on this particular cause of the crash?
Yes, the Iranian investigation into the issue, basically what had happened is the Americans were able to, although they failed to shut down the radars completely so they can fly in their stealth bombers, what they managed to do is disrupt the communication network between command and the individual units. So one of the units that is out in the vicinity of Tehran that saw in its radar missiles, confusing the flight with the missiles, because it had no communication anymore with the central command of the air defenses of Iran. They're authorized to take a decision on the ground then because they have no communication anymore with the command. So, and that's what happened. They shot at the Ukrainian civilian airliner and shot it down in an accident, an unfortunate accident. So we do have clear the investigation that was presented by Iran, and definitely those soldiers, by the way, were held responsible in Iran itself for that accident, although it was, as I said, an accident.
And this is, their radar was off like by 107 degrees. Now, I found Iran mentioning that what was at fault here, this is earlier in July of 2020, mentioning that their radars were off, that it was a human error. I haven't seen, and if you could send over a link, this is the first I'm hearing of this. If you can send over a link or something like that, I'd love to see where Iran is specifically linking that to scrambling by the U.S. because that makes sense as far as it goes. That's completely plausible. But I would want to see where they're saying that so I can look into that a little bit more. And part of the problem here is this was just a couple of days. This was within a week of the assassination of Soleimani. That kicked 2020 off, and of course things got a lot worse for the whole world very quickly. But this was a real flashpoint. It felt for a couple of days there, for a brief period, as if we were at the precipice of war, a major war, a major hot war in the region with Iran that would have potentially brought Iran in. I just want to, in closing here, Laith, how close do you feel we are to that war now? Have we taken a couple of steps back from that brink? But looking through to the rest of 2021, looking at the next few years, maybe the next decade, we've spoken about this before. What's your sort of doomsday clock for how imminent a world war would be at this point, Laith?
Look, after Iran retaliated for the assassinations on and attacked the American bases in Iraq, if you remember, everybody was expecting that there's going to be a war between Iran and the United States. But then President Trump at the time came out and said everything's all right, it's all okay. And that is exactly because the stealth bombers of the United States were actually painted red by the Iranian radars. And so what that means that we saw at the end of Trump's regime, and now with Biden there, the United States flying B-52s as its only deterrence that it can show to Iran, meaning that the only threat that it can make now towards Iran is a nuclear war. And that is something that will never happen. And if it happens, there will be a world war. The United States is in a situation right now that its own imagination of its power do not coincide with reality on the ground. And that's where the scary situation is. The United States needs to come back from the brink of the abyss. Otherwise, it's going to take the whole world down with it.
Laith, real quick question. So I remember this, and just looking up the information on it. There was a video that came out during that time that showed two missiles. One hit the plane, basically the argument is disabling the transponder, and then another one hitting the plane afterwards, in which the plane limps along and eventually crashes. These videos were uploaded to YouTube, and it seems like that may contest this idea that it was foreign play. I mean, it seems that even the people who were there were basically saying there was a serious mistake, but it seems like the argument is being made kind of in reverse, that this is a horrible tragedy. We couldn't have made this tragedy, ergo something else had to be going on. Hence, it had to be foreign interference in regards to the missile attack. You would admit that it is somewhat of a self-interested answer to that.
There is no doubt that Iranian air defenses shot down the Ukrainian plane. That's not what is put to question. The question is, how come the air defense system in that location and its radar saw on their systems that they're dealing with a missile? This is where one of the jamming methods that are used is to confuse the system of your opponent and make it see everything opposite to what it is. So a warplane would be identified as a civilian plane, and a missile would be identified as a civilian plane to hide them from your systems. And then the air defense systems have no choice but to fire on everything that's in the air. And that's what fired at what they saw as a missile and took it down. Leading to this accident, obviously.
No, I understand. This is the Iranian position on this one. Okay, that's fair. I mean, look, both sides can be aired out on that particular one, so I definitely wanted you to get your point in. The voice that you guys are listening to is Laith Marouf, an award-winning multimedia producer and broadcasting law consultant. You can follow Laith on Twitter at Laith Marouf, and his website is cmacenter.org. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
Fault Lines.
Shooting from the lip.
We're taking no prisoners here. Real opinions for real people. Where we bring you people with controversial views, and instead of trying to cash them out, we actually let them expand on their views. What's going on in British politics, European politics, and indeed in world politics as well. And wherever you are, whether you're a UKIP supporter, a Tory or Labour, everything is in turmoil.
John Gaunt.
Shooting from the lip.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. So we've been discussing UK politics recently, and UK politics have gotten fascinating. In the United States, when we found out that the PPP loans, instead of going to the small businesses that needed them, went instead to the major big businesses that did not necessarily need them, we were aghast. Well, the UK is experiencing something similar. Many of the companies that were getting contracts and getting loans were basically fast-tracked, VIP lane fast-tracked. What that basically ended up being was radical corruption. The owners were basically, the people who were getting the contract, billions of dollars in contracts, going to people who did not necessarily have experience in the thing to which they were getting the money for. The owner of a local pub got $42 million deal to supply vials of COVID tests. A finance company got $350 million contract for face masks. A pest company got $483 million to provide personal protection equipment. The British taxpayer, money was basically dumped in the hands of cronies. To discuss, we're joined by, to discuss this, and there's another issue that I really want to get to, we're joined by Alexander McCurris, editor-in-chief at the Rant. Alexander, welcome to the show, man.
Delighted to be with you again.
Absolutely. So I want to start here. I don't want to stay too long on this particular point, but what is going on this point, and how is the British public digesting this information? I mean, because this is somewhat of a big deal. Hancock was basically found that he was guilty of not exposing or not disclosing the information that was necessary to the tune of $42 billion. Right here. Basically Hancock was found to basically have broken the law. He wasn't living up to the responsibilities of transparency.
There was a High Court decision which said that Matt Hancock, who is our Health Secretary, the official who is most in charge of organising Britain's pandemic response, that he has actually broken the law on this matter. And you're absolutely right in saying that many people see corruption in this. Corruption not in the sense, perhaps, that any laws, any actual criminal laws were broken. I mean, civil laws, certainly there were. We've got a High Court decision that says that they were. But corruption in the sense that the government and powerful people in the government managed to ensure that the contracts, these very large contracts, went to people who were closely connected with it. So that the result is that some people have done very well out of the pandemic crisis. A pandemic crisis in which tens of thousands of people in Britain have died has enriched corruptly some people in Britain. And to answer your first question, many people in Britain are very upset and angry about this, but that anger has had no political effect. On the contrary, at this moment in time, the government's popularity is stable and the opposition Labour Party's popularity is falling because the opposition Labour Party is failing to make or capitalise on this issue. And its leader, Keir Starmer, the centrist who took over from Jeremy Corbyn, has actually said that he's not going to call for the resignation of Matt Hancock, the health secretary responsible for all of this, even though Hancock broke the law. And this has created bewilderment and bafflement, and many people are asking what is the Labour Party up to? And of course that means that people are now more angry, many people are now more angry with Starmer and the Labour Party than they are with the Conservatives and Hancock, even though it was the Conservatives and Hancock who authored this mess.
How weird.
That, I think, tells you a lot about the state of British politics now.
That's so weird.
And I think we were talking with Peter Oliver about this yesterday. What he was saying is that much like Hancock, Boris Johnson has had his hands caught in the cookie jar repeatedly, so to speak. And so if there's one politician in the country that is going to be unlikely to hit one of his supporters, let alone another politician, on accusations of graft or cronyism or nepotism, et cetera, it would be Boris Johnson. But what makes this a little bit more notable for me is Hancock is one of the people in charge of the country's COVID response. And, whether it's good timing on Johnson's part or what, but the messages earlier this week about lifting the lockdown and returning to some normal in the coming months in Britain, that seems to be dominating the conversation. We've only got so much time with you, Alexander. Thank you for being with us. Let's move to Alexei Navalny, who Amnesty and, quote unquote political prisoner. That's how the Western press has painted him for months now, for about a month. Long term, he's known in the West as one of the main opposition leaders. Only has a few percentage points in support of him in Russia, but regardless, known as one of the main opposition leaders against Putin in Russia, and of course has become a major figure in anti-Russian opposition politics, particularly in the last 8 months, since he was allegedly poisoned with a nerve agent in Russia, then taken to Germany, held there first in a coma, then released from that country, returned to Russia, then arrested on this ongoing case that began in 2014 when the French company Yves Rocher accused him and his brother of overcharging them. Anyway, there's a bunch of backstory here. There's also a defamation case against him that was settled within the last week, in which he was forced to pay a bit over 10,000 American dollars. There's a lot going on there. Amnesty International has recently come out. They had listed him as a prisoner of conscience. They have just reversed that decision after they faced an overwhelming response from members of their audience who were sending them articles showing that Alexei Navalny had a history of making pretty darn racist comments, anti-immigrant comments in Russia. There was one video he had posted on YouTube in which he was posing as a dentist and in reference to immigrants to the country, talking about removing teeth, removing whatever you need to remove, basically, like a dentist would. But again, referring to immigrants as rotten teeth, effectively. So anyway, Amnesty International has stripped him of the prisoner of conscience label. Basically, they don't give that label to people if they have engaged in hate crimes in the past. And in this case, Alexei Navalny has. They've been getting pressure from this. Anyway, this is in some sense a British story because MI6 and the British intel establishment seems to have been using Navalny and definitely supporting Navalny's efforts as an anti-Putin figure in Russia. And again, it's interesting to me that Amnesty International, when they made this move, they've been getting a lot of pushback. When I was first looking into this, the first article I saw was from Radio Free Europe Liberty, Radio Free Liberty Europe, basically just condemning this move. And very quickly, I moved to the BBC. Same thing. They had a little bit less biased a headline, but they were similarly just condemning this move. In our last couple of minutes here, Alexander, what's your take on this?
Well, I think it is extremely embarrassing to the British authorities. It is extremely embarrassing to Amnesty International. And you can get a sense, a feel of the extent of that embarrassment from the fact that there's been very little actual coverage of this matter in Britain at all. You follow Twitter, you will obviously know about it. If you go to the BBC and find that article, you will know about it too. But there's been a concerted attempt to say as little about this as possible. Now, to my mind, what has obviously happened is that clearly there was a rebellion against this decision by the Amnesty membership in Britain. But I also suspect that there was a lot of criticism of it from the Russian opposition, the real Russian opposition in Russia. And I mean here the liberal opposition in Russia, people like the Yabloko party, who and other liberals who are, of course, deeply antagonistic to Navalny, partly because of his ultra-nationalist politics, which he's never repudiated, but also because, frankly, I think they don't take him very seriously as a real opposition leader and find him offensive and unpleasant and difficult to work with. So I think this is an unpopular move in Russia amongst the opposition there.
1 minute.
Clearly an unpopular move in Britain with the Amnesty membership. But the establishment in Britain, which has staked a lot on Navalny and has backed him very heavily, is, I think, angry and embarrassed too. Sorry. And I think there's a fair chance, by the way, that we will see pressure to have this decision, this latest decision, by Amnesty reversed in some way. So we'll see how it pans out. I'm not sure that this story is over yet, but we will see how it works out.
Absolutely. No, you're 100% right on that. And Amnesty International, in a weird way, has one of the more prominent sort of think tank type groups that with this move has introduced a degree of cognitive dissonance into the official Navalny narrative that we really haven't seen in the West. We're out of time, though. Alexander Mercouris, the voice you heard, editor-in-chief of the Duran.com. Thank you for joining us, Alexander. We will be back in a minute with headlines and another 2 hours of this morning's show. Be right back.
Listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from the divided states of America, welcome to your daily inoculation for propaganda. In the left corner, I am the indefatigable, the ever-vigilant, the last antibody to a sick and seizing political system, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And in the independent corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
That means you are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. I'm going to change that opening. I'm beginning to dislike it. And because I feel like it doesn't explain it adequately. To say I'm the cure for propaganda, it's like, okay, what does that mean? And is that reflexive based on the attacks by like people like Psaki and everything else? I think what I'm trying to get across is that this American perspective that drops context is on some level a dishonest portrayal of the world. And my job is, if I'm sitting on the moon looking at events, trying to make it clear of like, look, this is a contextual reading of it. This is an honest reading of it, and you make your choice based on the honest reading of it, not based on the perspective that drops the context. Now, I don't know how to encapsulate that in 2 sentences. So you see my issue here. But no, I do think I want to update that, because I do think I want to be more specific in what I'm trying to get across. But let's do the headlines. In the news, at least 2,315 new coronavirus deaths and 71,732 cases, or new cases, were reported in the United States yesterday. Over the past week, there's been an average of 68,029 cases per day. That's a decrease of 37% from the average 2 weeks earlier. As of this morning, more than 28,279,000 people in the United States have been infected with the coronavirus, and more than 502,000 have died from it. Wow, the estimates were dead on. 500,000 within, January, February. Ghana has become the first country in the world to receive the vaccine acquired through the United Nations-backed COVAX initiative. The vaccines, delivered by UNICEF, arrived at Accra's Kotakas International Airport early Wednesday and are part of the first wave of COVID-19 vaccines that COVAX is sending to several low and middle income countries. Ghana's vaccination campaign will begin March 2nd and will be conducted in phases among prioritized groups, beginning with healthy workers, adults of 60 years and older, and people with underlying health conditions, frontline executive, legislative, judiciary, and their related staffs. The House is expected to approve President Biden's $1.9 trillion coronavirus relief proposal later this week. Excuse me. The bill includes $1,400 stimulus checks, extra money for vaccine distribution, and funding to state and local governments. It was approved by the Budget Committee on Monday by a vote of 19 to 16. Senate Democrats and Republican staffers are expected to meet with the parliamentarian this week to make their arguments for and against including the minimum wage provision. Look, again, whether or not this passes, Joe Biden and the Democratic Party has the power to do this. They could have gotten rid of the filibuster, that's one point. They're going to use reconciliation and Kamala Harris. If necessary, they can pull a strong arm tactic and have her overrule the parliamentarian. So it is within his power, once again, just like the student loan thing, it is in his power, just like the elimination of pot as, scheduled drug is in his power. These things are in his power. He just refuses to push to use them. Speaking of the person who fails to push to use them, President Joe Biden held his first bilateral virtual meeting with Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau on Tuesday. The two world leaders unveiled a U.S.-Canada partnership roadmap detailing the commitment on issues like combating COVID-19, tackling the climate crisis, bolstering continental defense, and strengthening global alliances. Trudeau and Biden both delivered televised statements on their partnership, but did not hold a traditional joint press conference. Biden is yet to hold a press conference as president. Interesting. Yeah, the anti-Trump puff of smoke, Joe Biden. This is like he's not even there. Top security officials who were responsible for protecting the Capitol on January 6th uprising appeared before Congress, the Senate Rules Committee, and the Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee for the first time on Tuesday. The officials who testified included former Senate Sergeant-at-Arms Michael Stenger, the former Secretary of Arms Paul Irving, former U.S. Capitol Police Chief Stephen Sund, and Robert Conte, acting chief of the Metropolitan Police Department. Democratic Senator Amy Klobuchar and the Rules Committee opened the hearing. Let's play the clip. Amy Klobuchar is being pretty brutal here.
We must have the facts, and the answers are in this room. When an angry, violent mob staged an insurrection on January 6th and desecrated our Capitol, the temple of our democracy, it was not just an attack on the building, it was an attack on our republic itself. We are here today to better understand what was known in advance, what steps were taken to secure the Capitol, and what occurred that day, because we want to ensure that nothing like this happens again.
The temple of democracy. Wow. We're not even a democracy in this country. We're a representative government, supposedly. But I love the turn of the phrase. You're attacking the temple of democracy itself. A little strong. I got to be honest. Cheating Sanders in 2016 was more of a significant issue from the standpoint of attacking democracy. That was undermining the individual who a large number of people wanted, and the party didn't. You don't have to believe me. You can read Donna Brazile in her own words in that particular, I believe it was a Politico article, making the point that, yeah, they cheated the guy. So I understand where she's going with this, and clearly I see it as a big deal because I've railed on this particular subject for God knows how long here. I've been the last man on the wall on this very specific issue of impeachment. But it's a little strong. And by the way, there was questions about, how long are the guards going to be there? How long are the troops going to be there in D.C. and that type of stuff? And so, look, I think they should have hearings. I think they should try to get to the bottom of how all of this started and everything. There should be a record keeping of this. But, you have to walk and chew gum. And the bills that these guys are trying to pass, they need to pass them sooner rather than later. In fact, I would argue that $2,000 should have been out by now. Indeed, that was something that they said they were going to do. They should have delivered. They had the votes to do it. But that's Klobuchar. Anything to say on this one, Shane? I mean, she's pretty strong.
Yes. I do. Yeah, two quick comments on this. One, I think you're right to focus on the bills. What we need is not more vilification of part of the American public. What we need is some attempt to make things better for people across the board. And then two, on that point, I wish in these impeachment hearings in general, there were more of a focus on constructive unity. That's what you want from statesmen or stateswomen or your leaders in general. You want people who can bring the country together. And this is a moment in which the country is more divided than it ever was. And that's what led to the crisis. That's what led to the breach on the Capitol building. And so the fact that they're focusing on vilifying the people who did it, which sure, you could do that, but the fact that they're focusing on that instead of focusing on what we can do to make everybody across the board, guilty or not, make everybody a little bit more secure in our country and a little bit more sane by communicating more effectively, whatever we can do towards that is going to be better. And it seems like they're pushing in all the wrong on all the wrong ends here, whether it's pushing to vilify the people who are doing this or pushing to control the spread of information so that certain perspectives aren't aired, certain voices aren't heard, in the hopes that somehow you're going to keep a lid on it. That doesn't work. That hasn't worked. It's not going to work. And so they haven't learned anything from it, and they're not doing the right things to solve it. Instead, it's political theater in which they're making one party the enemy of the American public, even though that party is a sizable minority of the American public. And in the process, I'll put it like this, what we saw was a kind of small-scale civil war. We're in a constant verbal civil war at this point, although it's low-grade conflict. What they're doing is just pushing that pendulum a bit further out. And I'm worried that we are all going to reap the consequences of that if they keep doing it, as well as if we keep having these crazy shows of force from people on the right. I don't want to leave them out of the conversation entirely, but we need to bring people together instead of try to make enemies out of some of us, because that doesn't help anybody. That's my take.
I think two things are true. I think, of course, they're going to investigate and they're going to prosecute. I think it scared them, the bejesus out of them. I mean, Nancy Pelosi has, $300 million in the bank. I would imagine her blood pressure doesn't get up for much of anything in real terms. But I bet it got up when, they had to rush and try to get away from the mob that was raiding the place. So I do think, of course they were going to prosecute. But I also think you're right on the second point. I just think both of those things exist together. I would love an honest take where they would come out and says, look, a lot of people are angry. There have been protests going on all of last year, and now we have had an attack on the Capitol. We really need to get to this notion of what's at the bottom of this. And maybe we think what's at the bottom is economic. And we're going to do something about it. Real terms, we're going to do something about it, and we're going to bring this country together because of it. And by the way, this gets to this whole conversation about bipartisanship. And my argument is bipartisanship is not the point. I would even go so far as to say the public doesn't even want or need bipartisanship. What they want is a government that is effective and works in their interests, no more, no less. And if that's without bipartisanship, because bipartisanship would mean that you're ineffective, then the American public will be on your side for it when you make that case. And because here's what's going to happen. If Joe Biden acquiesces to these demands of bipartisanship and everything else that these guys have thrown out, what Republicans will do when it gets to the point where it's realized that this was unsatisfactory, this didn't do what you needed to do, they would then turn around and say, and he wasn't bipartisan when he did it. He went it alone, despite the fact that the choices he was making to water down the deal would have been, based on the Republican ones. So, it doesn't pay to be that way. Your job is basically to win for the American public and deliver for the American public. That's what you were put in there for. And if you did that, you will bring the country together. Honestly. I mean, if you have a large number of people that basically lump onto your side because they say, oh, wait, this guy is workers or working for the workers, I do think you start bringing a large coalition of people together under your particular side. And the public believes that it has somebody fighting in their interests. I think both of those things are necessary. But I also think in the way that they're going, it also is going to create enemies and a certain degree of division. I can agree with you on both counts on this one. But let's keep going. Government has transported dozens of children to the first migrant children facility or child facility opened during the Biden administration, first opened during the Trump administration. The facility is being reactivated to hold up to 700 children. Government officials say the camp is needed because the facility for migrant children have to reduce occupancy during the COVID crisis. Now this breaches something that Joe Biden had been saying during the campaign, and the ACLU and many of the people were very reactive to seeing Joe Biden do this. Let's play the clip of Jen Psaki defending this particular decision. Andre.
Hey, Andre.
Oh, okay.
This is not kids being kept in cages. This is kids. This is a facility that was opened that's going to follow the same standards as other HHS facilities.
This is not kids being kept in cages, Shane. This is a facility that kids are going to be in that just so happen to have cages. What do you? I love the turn of a phrase, right? What do you think about this? I mean, this was something that was a big deal on the left, especially among people who are pushing for Biden immigration reform and everything else. And even though Biden has given executive orders trying to roll back some of the stuff that Trump did, the deals that Trump made with ICE apparently are more stick-to-itive than people would want. And putting cages, open this building or this facility up brings back bad memories that people, especially on the left and Democrats, don't like. What is your thought about this? Is this something that was necessary, or is this something that Joe Biden is doing for hashtag reasons?
Well, let's just see if people hit him on it. I mean, whether, we could return to I don't even think we ever had a debate, and I don't know that we would. It sounded like the ICE centers that we're talking about, they could have treated the kids a lot better. It's a thorny issue in general. If you're trying to deport the parents, what do you do with the children? But, if they're not being treated well, that's just base one. If you're going to detain them, and they're kids, for God's sake, make sure they're comfortable. Make sure they have the support they need, because it's already pretty damn difficult. But let's see if progressives hit Biden on this one. Let's see if liberals or anybody on, towards the left end of the established political spectrum, let's see if they hit Biden on it.
Well, I don't know if Democrats will. I mean, the dirty truth, the dirty, honest to God truth, is that those facilities were kept poorly, and those things were kept as places of deterrence because they didn't want people to come into the country. The thought was, if we can make it bad enough, then people wouldn't come here. And people wouldn't bring their kids here. I mean, listen to some of the speeches that these guys were given beforehand. They sounded a lot like Trump. I mean, Hillary Clinton and Biden were talking about building walls. And yeah, part of the mean-spiritedness of it was to basically create a disincentive for people to come to the country. The catch is, if you're fleeing a war zone, there's nothing that you're going to do, even withholding soap and other essentials for sanitary environment. Still maybe
stay fed
better.
To stay alive.
Yeah,
I hear you.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's like you're never going to get it to be that point, that horrible. And if you did get it to be that horrible, oh my God, what, you know what I mean? So yeah. So yeah, people were bothered by this, to put it mildly. And I think her defense here, I'm not sure if that is going to settle any nerves or any points of view. But those are your headlines. You're listening to headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we will be back in a moment.
Fault Lines. Want to talk? Get in touch with us at radio@sputniknews.com.
What's the most important hour of the day? It's the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon. On this show, we don't just deliver the latest headlines, we divide the real from the fake. Tune in to hear from some of the most brilliant political minds of today, get in-depth news and analysis that goes beyond the surface and dig straight into the details. Set your clock to the Critical Hour for a news perspective unlike any of those other guys. Tune in to the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon, weekdays 6 to 7 p.m. Eastern, and catch us on Facebook Live. You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio or video. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can send us a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement helps make the show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. We've been having a conversation on the show about the Uyghurs, and this is the group in China that America and some of the other countries have basically lumped on to the idea that a genocide is being committed. We've had guests on the show that have pushed back on this very strongly. In addition to some people that gave more of a moderate point of view on this and trying to give a well-rounded point of view of China's perspective in addition to the outcome of China's perspective, even though it doesn't rise to the level of genocide. In order to have this conversation and expand on this conversation, we're joined by independent journalist and author, best known as critic of the U.S. Constitution, American politics, government, and social policy in general. He has written a number of books, including Moses to ISIS, The Intelligent Heretic's Guide to Monotheism, The Frozen Republic, The Velvet Coup, and America's Undeclared War. And of course, I'm talking about Daniel Lazare. Daniel, welcome to the show. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So, like I said, we've been having this conversation about the Uyghurs, and the question of genocide has basically been invoked. Now, to me, genocide is a heavily loaded word. I mean, it's reminiscent of the Nazis or the Turks in regards to the Armenians. And yet, in this very specific instance, is being used to hit China. And it seems that this is being used for political casting because, I got to be honest, I don't necessarily buy the Western argument on this very specific front. It seems that this is flack that's being thrown, but it's just so happened that this one is particularly damaging if indeed it's being used for political reasons. What is your thought on this? Is this being used for political reasons? Is this a loaded word? Or do you believe that this is, in some degree, indicative of what is taking place to the Uyghurs in China and the re-education camps?
No, I think it's obviously being used for political reasons, and it's obviously a loaded word. In fact, genocide is like one of my least favorite terms. I mean, classically it applies to the Jews during World War II or the Armenians in Turkey during World War I, or the Ottoman Empire, I should say. Those are the classic cases. But since then, it's been applied willy-nilly to a wide variety of cases, very, very sloppily. And this is a perfect example. I don't want to whitewash the Chinese state because it is clearly going through an intense period of nationalism. And nationalism means means levels of intolerance to other ethnic groups. That's invariably the outcome. And we also know that in the past there have been periods of oppression of the Uyghur population in Western China. In 1962, for example, I believe, 60,000 Uyghurs fled from China to the Soviet Union to escape Maoist repression. So there is a history of repression, and there are reasons to think that there's some kind of nationalist intolerance going on, and there may be repression happening, discrimination, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't want to dismiss the possibility of that, but I do think that the term genocide is outrageously misapplied. It's being used by a lot of far-right, dubious characters. I mean, one person who's in the center of a lot of these reports is a West German born-again Christian named Adrian Zenz, who was on the far, far right of the political spectrum. And so that's where a lot of the information is coming from. And the very fact that the propaganda is so well orchestrated, just can't help but make you, think twice and wonder what the real story is. I mean,
genocide, it's not just a loaded term, but of course, where people's mind, like you're saying, whether it's the Armenian genocide, like you were saying, during World War I, or for most people, where your mind immediately goes is World War II and the Nazis' treatment of the Jews, the Holocaust, et cetera. That's while the Holocaust did not get us into that war, that is, I would say, the brunt of what we remember about it. And therefore, the word genocide, I think, can be seen if a country is committing genocide. I think for Western audiences, if you look at what we've done, what our military, what we've seen as a casus belli, what we've seen as justification for declaring war, it is human rights abuses approaching genocide. Not even that order of magnitude, but if we look at accusations that Saddam Hussein was gassing Iraqi civilians or that Bashar al-Assad was gassing Syrian civilians. Those are the kinds of things that we have used to justify intervention, what we call it, overseas, which is really an invasion. And that those are not even approaching the level of atrocity that would be incurred by the use of the word genocide. In other words, what I'm worried is with first Pompeo in the last days of Trump's administration calling China, a nation guilty of committing genocide, and then Antony Blinken, the next Secretary of State, signing on to that, saying that he agreed with that designation. What I'm worried about is multiple administrations in a row setting themselves up not to declare war on China right now, but setting ourselves up where that would be a major column if we decided to get into an armed engagement with them to justify it. And that seems like a completely rational fear on my part. And therefore, I think it's worth looking really closely at whether or not that term can actually be used, whether that's a valid term for us to use here. But for that, I think it would make sense for us to go back and look at some of the history of the Uyghurs, look at some of how they have acted in the nation of China, as well as how they have, of course, been treated by China. We'd need to go into re-education camps. And unfortunately, a lot of this stuff is a little bit murky because there are conflicting reports about exactly what the camps are for, exactly the level of intolerance that Uyghurs face in China. All this stuff is sort of up in the air. And I'll put it like this has been going on for years now, but the COVID crisis, the fact that there are travel lockdowns, that certainly doesn't help journalists getting in and having free reign to do their investigations, although, of course, the Chinese state has pushed back against that as well. But let's go back to the history here. Can you please set it up for us, Daniel? As much as you know, because we're still novices on this stuff, who are the Uyghurs? How have they been treated and how have they acted in the Chinese state? What's their role as an ethnic group, predominantly Muslim, Central Asian? That's I know that their food is tasty and I know where they live, but I don't know very much about their culture, anything like that. Can you please set this up for us, Daniel?
Yeah. I mean, first of all, there's this place called Eurasia, and Eurasia stretches 9,000 miles across the world, and the central part, Central Asia, what we call Central Asia, has always been a source of turbulence and political instability, going back literally thousands of years. This is where not only the Mongol invasion, but previously the source of successive Turkic invasion. So it's an area of turbulence, an area that always posed huge problems for the outlying empires, whether they were the Tsarist Empire on one hand or the Chinese Empire on the other hand. And so China, going back to the mid-first millennium AD, extended political control into what is now Xinjiang, and established tutelage there. But the control varied over the years. They broke away. They didn't break away. And the turbulence, was ongoing. And more recently, there's no doubt that with the breakup of the Soviet Union, that Central Asia has come into play. After being pacified by the Soviets and the Chinese communists, it's now back in play. It's up for grabs. And there's no doubt that Western intelligence is aware of this, has a hand in this pie, is stirring things up madly. In Syria, for example, Uyghur jihadis were a major presence. And so certainly Wahhabist ideology penetrated deep into the Uyghur area, and China had a major problem with upsurges of Uyghur violence, or what we would call terrorism, mass stabbings, other kinds of attacks, people in cars running down civilians, etc. So China had to pacify what was clearly a center of Wahhabist agitation. And whether that Wahhabist agitation had connections with Western intelligence, it seems reasonable to suspect that it did, okay? I can't go any farther than that because that's all we know. So China has taken measures to sort of tamp down this violence, to rein in Muslim extremism, Muslim fundamentalism, etc. And that has meant campaigns against the veil, against beards, against even naming children with names like jihad or Islam or Muhammad, etc. It's involved various kinds of cultural re-education. Now, But as to how harsh that is, and is open to interpretation, and of course, cultural re-education often blends in with just plain education and economic development. And there are wild stories about birth control and forced abortions being imposed on the Uyghur population. It doesn't seem to be true. It may be true in certain isolated, instances, but there is no evidence it's being applied on a broad scale. In fact, Uyghur population growth, broadly measured, has actually outstripped Han Chinese population.
And that's the 92% of the Chinese population, as far as I can tell, is of Han Chinese ethnic descent. We need to go into an early break here. So we're going to bring you back on the other side of this, but we're going to keep talking about this. We're joined, for those listening, by Daniel Lazar. He's an independent journalist and author, best known as a critic of the U.S. Constitution, American politics, government, and social policy in general. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be right back on the other side of this short break.
Fault Lines. We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Epidemics and pandemics could kill millions of people, and they actually did. Centuries ago, deadly outbreaks called the Black Death, the Plague of Justinian, and the Spanish flu ravaged countries, empires, and whole continents. Some of these diseases are still present around the globe. Others have become a thing of the past. Discover how these ancient and not so distant outbreaks from previous centuries differ from modern-day SARS, MERS, and coronavirus pandemics. Listen to our new series, Outbreak, the deadliest epidemics in human history. This week on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we are joined by Daniel Lazar. He is an independent journalist and author. He's best known as a critic of the U.S. Constitution, American politics, government, and social policy in general. We're talking about the Uyghurs, though, and I see, Daniel, you were also making the rounds a few weeks ago talking about the Myanmar crisis after the coup on February 1st. But let's get back to this conversation. As we closed out, we were talking about the Uyghur birth rate, which, again, the Chinese government has been accused first by Secretary of State Pompeo, then followed on by Antony Blinken, who signed off on Pompeo's statement. They've been accused of genocide. Then this week, Canada labeled them a nation committing genocide as well. So in the West, you've got a few nations now signing off on this statement, which again worries me because in our American wartime, ingot, the air guide, our way of justifying our wars, genocide is above the level of human rights abuses that we are usually willing to, quote unquote, tolerate. In other words, we will declare wars on other countries for less than genocide. So if we're accusing China of genocide, I can't help but think that would set us up for the declaration of a war at some point in the future. We're getting back into it. We're talking about how the Uyghurs actually have a higher birth rate than the Han Chinese population. This is partly triggered, I would say. You were mentioning Adrian Zenz. The grayzone.com had a great article on Adrian Zenz, who has served as a primary source for claims that the Uyghurs, that their birth rate was being controlled in order to selectively genocide that population. But if you look at China's policies, they had a one-child policy for a long time. They were basically trying to, reduce the overall population growth rate as a part of their, in my opinion, heavy-handed policies of domestic control. They've since replaced that with a two-child policy growth rate, but they're still facing a birth rate slump. They're trying to correct that, but you've had significant losses, significant drops in the base sort of reproduction rate for the country for years now. And as you were saying, the Uyghur population seems to be an exception to that. Maybe we can get a little bit deeper into Adrian Zenz. Who is he? You were talking about him as a sort of more far-right political figure in Germany. Am I right in saying that he seems to be the primary source for this specific plank in the claim that the Chinese government is guilty of genocide? What has he said, and how is it wrong? Daniel?
Well, Adrian Zenz he's a born again Christian, an ultra rightist who inveighs against gays, for example, against abortion advocates, etc. He's tied up with various far right organizations, and according to no less a source in the Wall Street Journal, he is the man at the center of this propaganda barrage. And his information is very one-sided. It's factually dubious, and the question of population growth is a very important one. I mean, as you point out, the one-child policy was very heavy-handed. I think it was a very bad policy. It had all kinds of negative consequences, and it was repressive. It was repressive and undemocratic, and the Chinese people have reason to be angry about it. But interestingly enough, the minority groups were exempted from the requirement. So actually, the Uyghur population saw higher rates of growth. So as an example, one could argue, and probably a Han Chinese nationalist would argue, that the Communist Party was tougher on the ethnically Chinese population than it was on the outlying minorities. And I'm not trying to, I don't want to let the Chinese CP off the hook, because they're guilty of a lot of crimes and they deserve criticism, etc. But can't be one-sided and imbalanced in our critique. This reminds me tremendously about Tibet. I was checking the New York Times, and references to Tibet went through the roof around the year 2010 and then have dropped off. And now you barely hear about Tibet. And all the stories about cultural imperialism and repression of Tibetan language and religion have dropped off the map. Now, is this because the Chinese have suddenly gotten, more liberal and more democratic with a small d? Or is it simply the case that the mighty Wurlitzer of Western propaganda has moved on? So that rather than a barrage of Tibet horror stories, we now have a barrage of Uyghur horror stories. I suspect very strongly it's the latter.
I agree that there's probably criticism. In all countries on some level, criticism can be leveled at those countries. And I also agree on this very specific issue that despite China potentially maybe doing things wrong on this front, is there an honest, what's the real accounting of this in a contextual way that would make some level of sense? We were going back and forth here. Is there an argument to be made that the re-education camps are just necessary? Now, the reason why I'm asking this, we tend to be really dodgy about this idea, and this is not me saying pro re-education camp. I'm putting that out there right now. But is there something to be said? We are dodgy about this notion of our thoughts being affected or our minds being affected, brainwash. We hate that, the idea that we're being controlled or something like that. But what happens when part of your population is alienated? And in their alienation, they're being used by other forces. I mean, it was done in Afghanistan. It was done in Syria and Libya, basically using opposition forces as a battering ram, pushed on by imperial forces. Same thing in South America. It seems to be a playbook. But in this very specific case, especially from the standpoint of the terrorists, well, they have an ideology. And that ideology is, you can make a case to say it might have started off as environmental concerns, but at a certain point, it becomes a religious dogma that is almost breaching on the level of insanity. I mean, the moment that you're saying it is okay to murder somebody for my God, despite the God being all powerful, he can't necessarily handle his own affairs. I mean, that's somewhat problematic. And if they are setting stuff on fire, if they're blowing stuff up, if they're putting people in cages and drowning them, well, is it insane for China to take a purview that those people need to be re-educated, quote unquote, in regards to getting them acclimated to the society itself, and not just acclimated to the society, but to pull them out of that thought process? I mean, this is somewhat of a risky, treacherous argument to make, I know, but is there a point to be made there? What do you think?
It's not risky and treacherous. I mean, first of all, it's not just simply an ideology that that has run amok, but an ideological machine that has run amok. Since 1979, Saudi Arabia, with U.S. backing, no one knows the true figures, but they're as high as $100 billion. That's how much the kingdom has spent for Wahhabist propaganda worldwide.
Yes.
And this propaganda wave has transformed Islam from the suburbs of Paris to the western fringes of the People's Republic of China. These vast areas have been Wahhabized, and all other forms of Islam have been driven out. Now, China was facing a major problem. There were major problems with the Wahhabization, if I may call it, of the Western population. Significant, powerful, major upsurges of terrorism. A major Uyghur presence in Syria, and those Uyghur jihadis were undoubtedly traveling back and forth between Western China and Syria, bringing this jihad ideology with them. And China had to take measures to preserve its national integrity. And undoubtedly, there's just no doubt about it that Western intelligence had a hand in this process. I mean, just no doubt about it. That this is not paranoid. It's not conspiracy thinking. It's just simple realism. And so China had to take things in hand. It had to agitate against beards. It had to agitate against the tail.
I hear where you're going with that, and we are agreed in condemning Wahhabism and condemning Saudi Arabia for supporting Wahhabism, relatively recent philosophical, religious ideology within Islam, resulting from the sort of ideological intermarriage and literal intermarriage between Ibn al-Wahhab and the Saudi family back in the early 19th century, and they've been dealing with the consequences of it ever since, even though they've been funding it. But I mean, Mohammed bin Salman, for instance, recently said, there is no such thing as Wahhabism. I don't know what you're talking about, basically, in response to questions about it, which, again, like you're saying, is completely ridiculous because they're one of the primary sources. They're the primary source, as far as I can tell, of funding for the groups that have incited and done terrorism themselves. They've done this stuff. The Saudis have done this stuff more than ever.
Yeah, this is something we Clinton admitted. If you remember back in the emails, when the emails were released behind the scenes, it was like, hey, yeah, we need to do something about, we need to restrain Saudi Arabia. They are pushing this stuff around the globe. They know it. They know it. Well, please continue.
Yeah, and which is why it's insane for Pompeo and then for Blinken to accuse Iran of being the world's largest funder of terror. Like, what are they? It's ridiculous. But I want to come back to China and the Uyghurs here for a minute. Wouldn't it be the equivalent? So 9/11 happens, early 2000s. Wouldn't it be the equivalent of us putting a bunch of random Muslims into re-education camps? Like, if that's the justification, I get what you're saying, de-radicalization programs, okay, fine as far as that goes. But isn't this, is the claim here that Uyghurs as an ethnic minority group are Wahhabists across the board, and therefore you need to take whatever policies you can in order to quote unquote re-educate them or de-radicalize them? Because I don't see that being the case. Surely Muslims, predominantly a Muslim group, but does that make them all terrorists? Or maybe I'm misrepresenting your claim here. Daniel, what's your take?
No, I agree. I mean, you've got to be very, very careful in how you go about doing this. Now, of course, not all Uyghurs are Wahhabists. Not all Wahhabists are Uyghurs. There's just no doubt about that. You've got to be very careful, very sensitive, very democratic in how you apply these policies. But there is no doubt that Wahhabism made extensive inroads in the Uyghur population, and the Chinese, and that was undoubtedly with Western approval. You said before you condemned the Saudis for embarking on this massive propaganda offensive over the last half century. Well, you got to condemn the United States, which was right behind it, and was pushing Wahhabism. And then of course Wahhabism blew up in its face with 9/11. But the U.S. then moved to cover that up as fast as it could.
Funding. I mean, you could be talking about a number of things, but specifically funding the Taliban. 1988, 1989, the late 80s, in our war with the quickly declining Soviet Union. That would be the sort of prominent number one. Although, of course, we've had a weird tattered alliance with Saudi Arabia for decades now with the whole petrodollar thing. We've got a minute left. What are you talking about there, Daniel?
Well, first of all, the alliance with Saudi Arabia is America's oldest ally in the Middle East, older than Israel. FDR left the Yalta conference a day early so he could meet with Ibn Saud in the middle of the Suez Canal in February 1944 to seal the pact between the U.S. and the Saudis. The U.S. built that state up virtually from scratch, and that immense Wahhabist propaganda machine is as much an American creation as it is a Saudi creation, ironically. And undoubtedly, Western intelligence has used this as the web in order to pry loose Chinese control from the Western areas, in Xinjiang, for example. Now, the Chinese have responded to it as one would expect them to. Whether they've responded to it well is another question. But this whole agitation about genocide is just, it's just a ridiculous example of Western propaganda, raised to the nth degree. I mean,
agreed.
Human rights have been weaponized. Agreed. And genocide is the H-bomb of human rights. Sorry, go on.
It is true. That's a good way to put it. And again, I mean, I don't think we've said this yet, but the problem with abusing terms like these is that you dilute them in the process. And I'm worried that, by using this term against China for what they're doing, which I disagree with in parts, but which you need to understand from multiple sides, we're going to denude the term genocide. And that's not a term you want to soften in any way by misapplying it in cases where it doesn't fit. That's something you want to keep as harsh as it should be for exactly what it means. But we need to go into our break. You have been hearing the voice of Daniel Lazare. He's an independent journalist and author. He's best known as a critic of the U.S. Constitution, American politics, government, and social policy in general. He has written a number of books, including From Moses to ISIS, The Intelligent Heretic's Guide to Monotheism, The Frozen Republic, The Velvet Coup, and America's Undeclared War. Daniel, one quick request. You still there with us?
Yes, I'm here.
One quick request. Would you have any interest or any time in staying with us? We're taking calls on the other side of the segment. Now, I know I was closing you out there, but would you be... Okay, cool. Yeah, we'll come back with Daniel in a minute. We're taking calls when we come back. 202-521-1320 is the number. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be right back on the other side of the short break.
Fault Lines. Radio Sputnik. We speak your language. Find us at SputnikNews.com.
Stuck in traffic? No problem. Stay informed. Stay tuned to Radio Sputnik on 105.5 FM or 1390 AM in the Washington, D.C. area. Need more? Follow us on Facebook or check us out on SputnikNews.com.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we are in an open call segment. We continue to be joined by our guest, Daniel Lazare. He's an independent journalist and author. If you want to join in the conversation we were just having or talk about the Constitution, politics, any of the news of the day, whether it fits what we were just talking about, what Daniel would be good to talk about, or just what's on your mind, you can feel free to call in 202-521-1320. Again, that's 202-521-1320. Jamarl, we have our private back channel chat going on. We talked throughout the show, of course. And when you said you wanted to get into that argument, I responded pretty strongly. Basically, you were saying, are re-education camps justified? And I admit I was a little bit too cautious about that one, or a little bit too cynical about how you put
statement, because we don't. And in the United States, we are, the ultimate individualists, right? Rugged individualists. That's what we like to call ourselves. And so this idea of somebody putting thoughts in your head or telling you what to think or trying to get you to think in a particular way, we have qualms about that, like almost in a religious way. And so you have a situation where somebody is warped in their mindset. Because look, if you were raised in a situation where you were told things that were just radically ridiculous, or that caused violent harm to others, or for the most part that was alienative, regardless of how and why you got to that particular point of view, you could be raised to think the same way, just like anybody else could. It's like there but go the grace of God go I. And so if you were born and whatever reason, however you got to that point, you get a sort of warped mentality. Let's take Nazis, for example. Basically, uber fascists. I mean, how do you get rid of that? Like, are you supposed to pretend that doesn't exist? Do you just put that person in prison for God knows how long? Or do you try to connect that person to the larger society? And even if they go too far in that, is that really the basis of it? Meaning, look, we can't allow an alienated sector in society. We can't allow these guys to blow stuff up out of some kind of terrorism, nor are we just going to pretend it doesn't exist. We're going to confront it head on, and we're going to try to pull these people in. But the catch is, it could go too far. It could be too aggressive. And so it's like, what is the intent versus what is the execution of it? And, you know, from our standpoint in the West, we immediately call it genocide. I think that's, you know, farcical. If indeed the origin and the point of this is to orient some of the people to our way of thinking, or the society's way of thinking. There's one thing I want to bring up, though. The Gray Zone article, and Daniel, I want you to weigh in on this. The Gray Zone published an amazing article called Reuters BBC Bellingcat participated in a covert UK office funded program to weaken Russia, the leaked documents. Now, when this was put on Twitter, Twitter put a label on this basically saying this is leaked documentation. And people were making the point that, well, wait a minute, you don't do the leaked documentation for when it's against other places. Why are you all of a sudden putting a label on this? Also, Twitter, right here, our investigation found and removed a network of 69 fake accounts that can be reliably linked to the Russian state. Here, I love this part. A number of these accounts amplified narratives that align with the Russian government. I have no idea what that means. While another subset of the network focused on undermining faith in NATO alliance and its stability. They got rid of accounts because they were undermining the faith in NATO. Isn't that amazing? This is supposed to be a platform, and yet they seem to be acting as a publisher. Daniel, what are your thoughts?
There's no doubt that there's a major wave of repression going on in the West, a major wave of ideological regimentation. I mean, the idea, that someone gets in trouble because they publish opinions that align with those of the Russian government is absurd. I mean, the Russian government, believes that 2 + 2 = 4. Does that mean that if I write an article, arguing that I'm therefore a Russian agent? I mean, this is just nonsense, and it's been going on for at least 5 years, and it's being perpetrated, by the way, by Democrats more than Republicans. Democrats have been far more aggressive in this regard because they use it as a club, with which to beat Donald Trump, on the head, and it kind of worked too because Trump is now out of office. So it just keeps getting worse and worse. And as a result, you see this kind of propaganda campaign about the Uyghurs, and it's based on very scanty evidence, and yet it's uniform. I mean, every major outlet repeats the same line, and no one, absolutely no one, raises the slightest question about what are obvious contradictions and absurdities. So everyone falls into line just perfectly. It's amazing.
And if we come back to them pulling the tweets about NATO, questioning or criticizing NATO, we got a caller, so I want to go to him, but I want to quickly point out that is exactly the kind of exactly the kind of speech that's supposed to be free. That's exactly the kind of speech that you're supposed to protect. What is politically dangerous, and I don't mean dangerous in any kind of violent sense, but what is offensive to the establishment or offensive to established interests. That is exactly and specifically the speech that you should be trying to protect most in a polity. Because if you don't clear the way for that speech, that is like the sort of baseline against which protections on free speech can be judged. If you can say whatever you want except what's critical of the establishment, then you don't have free speech. You have, you've completely eroded the goal there. We got a caller though. I think we should go to him. Exactly. We got a lot more to talk about clearly, but let's go to Malik calling in from DC. Malik calling in from DC. Malik, you're on the line. What's going on, man?
No, I appreciate that, Shane. Listen, I'm calling in not to attack. I feel the purpose of you guys take callers because you believe in open and honest discourse and oftentimes honest and reasonable critique. And as I've called in before, I think, I'm disturbed at times by the position that I'm watching progressives, and Daniel, I don't know if you consider yourself a progressive or what. I was born a Muslim in this country, but I was also politically educated by former revolutionaries of the 60s and former Black Panther Party members, some who were Black Liberation Army and did time in prison. My political positions tend to be radical. And so the Communist Party in 1951 put forth an argument that Africans in America that the American government is engaged in a protracted process of genocide in America. Most people disagree with that. I don't disagree with that. There are people who would say the Palestinians are being genocided. I don't disagree with that. And so I'm disturbed by the position, and it seems to be I wouldn't say a knee-jerk defense of China, but definitely a concerted effort to defend China against policies. The Chinese, everyone knows, listen, I love Chinese culture. I grew up in New York City loving Chinese culture, but I know that the Chinese are not necessarily accepting of dissent, of varying cultures. It's can you speak to that? Can you speak honestly to the fact that there's very likely a lot of truth to this, and I'll admit to having this situation come into my political consciousness just over the past year. So I admit that there's a lot that I need to research with regard to Uyghurs, but I would love to hear from moderate Uyghurs themselves around what is actually going on.
Agreed. No, look, I agree with you, Malik. I mean, I think the problem that I have is it's hard to differentiate between what's propaganda and what's true. And when it's hard to differentiate with that, how can you come down hard one way or the other? You're stuck with this kind of thing of, all right, well, I think something might be going on, but what's the extent to which something is going on? And if you want to call that a defense, fair enough. I think it's just the benefit of the doubt in a politically charged climate. That's the way I frame it. I don't frame it as taking a hard position one way or the other because I don't necessarily know the entire reality of it, even though I accept the point that, yeah, there may be a try or an attempt to bring people into the fold. I mean, but I think the thing that you got to confront is that there's a difference between who you are versus who would blow up a building or would stab somebody. You know what I mean? That's a difference. I wouldn't necessarily categorize you as being a revolutionary as the same thing as being a terrorist. I don't think those things are the same. And so I feel you on this, but I don't think you apply in the definitions to which I'm using on this case. At the very least in the potential argument that I made about the Uyghurs and re-education camps. Daniel and Shane, what do you guys think?
Well, I could like to jump in. I mean, Malik raised at least two really important points. I mean, one is first of all, we both agree that Black people in the U.S., Palestinians in the Middle East are subject to extreme repression, and that their cases cry out for some kind of democratic reform, democratic with a small d, and that reform is not happening, and people have a right to be angry, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But I just distinguish between genocide and repression. Genocide is I'm very much opposed to what I call rhetorical inflation, and genocide means the actual physical destruction of a people. And that is not happening, fortunately, with regard to Black people, and it's not happening, fortunately, with regard to Palestinians, by the way, whose numbers have quadrupled since 1968. So this is not to let the Israeli government off the hook or the U.S. government off the hook. It's just simply what the numbers tell us. And regarding the Chinese, not being necessarily receptive to outside cultural influences, yeah, that's true. But that's true of everybody. I mean, Americans, Germans, Brits, French, African Americans, for example. I mean, everybody has their own orientation. Everybody is both resistant to and attracted to outside influences. And so, yeah, there are undoubtedly problems in this respect in China.
30.
And as I said before,
Daniel, we're going to have to cut you off there, but I think we get your point. It's like, yeah, there are problems in China, but at the same token, they have to be put in context. Look, I really appreciate you on this. It's funny, Jane and I were talking back and forth just saying, wow, this was a great segment. Daniel Lazar is an independent journalist and author, best known as critic of the U.S. Constitution, American politics, government, and social policy in general. He's written a number of books, including From Moses to ISIS, The Intelligent Heretic's Guide to Monotheism, The Frozen Republic, The Velvet Coup, and America's Undeclared War. You can follow Daniel on Twitter at DHLazar and find his column on Weekly Worker, co.uk, Strategic Culture, and many others. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we'll be back in a moment.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault Lines.
Live from across the divided states of America, it is now time for our last hour this morning of the most disruptive show in American and global politics, talking about news, politics, events, culture, and more across our divided states, as well as across the surface of our divided globe. In the independent corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Brennan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, the honest actor, the last man on the wall, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together we are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right, I hope everybody's morning continues to go well. We're getting back into the headlines. First up in COVID news, at least 2,315 new coronavirus deaths and 71,737 new cases were reported in the United States yesterday. Over the past week, there has been an average of 68,029 cases per day. That's a decrease of 37% from the average 2 weeks earlier. As of this morning, more than 28,279,000 people in the United States have been infected with the coronavirus, and more than 502,000 have died from it. Ghana has become the first country in the world to receive vaccines acquired through the United Nations-backed COVAX initiative. It took a while, I'll put it like that. The vaccines delivered by UNICEF arrived at Accra's Kotoka International Airport early Wednesday and are part of the first wave of COVID-19 vaccinations that COVAX is sending to several low and middle-income countries. Ghana's vaccination program will begin March 2nd and will be conducted in phases among prioritized groups, beginning with health workers, adults of 60 years and over, people with underlying health conditions, frontline executives, legislature, judiciary, and their related staff. Coming back to the United States in political news, nationally, the House is expected to approve President Biden's $1.9 trillion coronavirus relief proposal later this week. The bill includes $1,400 stimulus checks, extra money for vaccine distribution, and funding to state and local governments. It was approved by the Budget Committee on Monday by a vote of 19 to 16. Senate Democratic and Republican staffers are expected to meet this week to make their arguments for and against including the minimum wage provision. President Joe Biden held his first bilateral virtual meeting with Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau on Tuesday. We'll join those two words together. Two world leaders unveiled a U.S.-Canada partnership roadmap that details their commitment on issues like combating COVID-19, tackling the climate crisis, bolstering continental defense, strengthening global alliances, and apparently jointly condemning the Chinese state on grounds of genocide. We were just talking about that for a good 45 minutes, almost straight, with Daniel Lazar, our last guest. Good couple of segments there, and we went back and forth on it a number of times, including with Malik calling in at the end there. Trudeau and Biden, getting back to the headline, have both delivered televised statements on their partnership, but did not hold a traditional joint press conference. In fact, Biden has yet to hold a press conference as president. Top security officials who were responsible for protecting the Capitol on the January 6th uprising appeared before the Senate Rules Committee and the Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee for the first time yesterday. The officials who testified included former Senate Sergeant-at-Arms Michael Stanger, former House Sergeant-at-Arms Paul Irving, former U.S. Capitol Police Chief Stephen Sund, and Robert Conti, acting chief of the Metropolitan Police Department. Democratic Senator Amy Klobuchar, the Rules Committee chairwoman, opened the hearing with this bit. Andre, let's play this first clip.
We must have the facts, and the answers are in this room. When an angry, violent mob staged an insurrection on January 6th and desecrated our Capitol, the temple of our democracy, it was not just an attack on the building, it was an attack on our republic itself. We are here today to better understand what was known in advance, what steps were taken to secure the Capitol, and what occurred that day, because we want to ensure that nothing like this happens again.
And there she was. And again, I'll put my 2 cents in here. I wish it were more on unifying. I wish that the response to what happened on January 6th were more about like solving fundamental problems in this country, addressing them first, and then how do we solve them, and trying to bring people together instead of condemning the few who engaged, the many who didn't, but supported we were criticizing the election process basically, which is as much a right as any in America, as far as I can tell. I wish it weren't as much about that and about, suppressing freedom of speech by calling it misinformation or domestic extremism or whatever. But that, I don't know, that's just my take. Jamarl, we already talked about this. Any quick comment before we move on?
Just that, I can agree with you. I do think it's on some level creates a certain degree of division, even though I do believe it's necessary for them to have these investigations and everything else. But I also agree that I do wish that there was a larger context. Why were those people there? Why were the people pissed off going back for the last year? Why is there all this consternation in regards to the way that people are yelling and angry and everything else? And is it really just because of Trump? Or is there something deeper that gets to this kind of angst in the society itself? I think it's something deeper. I don't think it's that shallow. But that's the stuff that they never touch. And so the only thing we're going to get is these trials. That's basically it. So it's unfortunate. But, because I wanted Joe Biden, honestly, last year when all of the riots and the protests were taking place, and Joe Biden comes out, gives a speech, and he basically attacks the people who were protesting or the rioters, in addition to making some other context in regard to the people who were being shot. I would have loved at that moment for him to give a contextual point of view that dealt with economics, that dealt with the plight of the various people who were in various communities, that incentivized that particular behavior. I wish he would have given a, kind of set the pace or set the tone or set the framing from his standpoint. But he didn't do that. And none of them really ever do that, these level of politicians. So, it's unsatisfying, but this is where we are.
Yeah, I'll put it like this. Another way of putting this, and it's already been put this way before, Trump was not the cause. Trump, in some sense, was the problem. He was the outgrowth of deeper problems, just like Obama was. And I'm not likening Trump to Obama in any real sense other than them both being presidents. But, Obama in 2008 ran on hope and change, effectively. Trump ran on something pretty darn similar about making America great again and serious, deeper reforms in our country. Now, whether either of them actually managed to accomplish those reforms, I'm pretty sure we're both a little bit. Obama had Obamacare. Trump, in some ways, slowed down our interventionism overseas. But I'm a little bit more cynical about it. But regardless, I think it's worth stating again, he is not the actual underlying problem here. He was just a higher level symptom of that problem. And that, again, has been put in like 1,000, been said 1,000 times in like only half a dozen ways. And so it might get tiresome to hear, but I think it's worth saying one more time. Back to the news. The government has transported dozens of children to the first migrant child facilities opened during Biden's administration, first opened during the Trump administration, now reopened. The facility is being reactivated to hold up to 700 children. Government officials say the camp is needed because facilities for migrant children have had to reduce occupancy during the COVID crisis. Here's Jen Psaki defending that decision. Andre, let's play this quick clip.
This is not kids being kept in cages. This is kids. This is a facility that was opened that's going to follow the same standards as other HHS facilities.
And there we go. That's just a round defense. I don't know what else to say.
The very next question should have been, are there going to be cages in those facilities? That should have been the very next question, because she's basically saying, you guys are going to have kids in cages. No, we have a facility. We have a new facility that's going to follow the standards. Yeah, but do they have cages in those facilities that's going to follow whatever standards? And if so, my original impression of kids in cages was right. Like, I mean, have they gotten rid of the cages? What are they using? You know what I mean? Like, the kids aren't just running around in the rooms. Are they using prison cells? Like, with the doors in the prison cells? Are those better somehow than cages? Like, what are they using? I think the point that people are making is this is an extension of Trump. And you said you were going to have a new lease on this stuff. That's their issue.
I hear you. Back to the headlines. The United States is seeking election to the United Nations Human Rights Council 3 years after former President Donald Trump's administration withdrew from it. Secretary of State Antony Blinken has stated, quote, "I'm pleased to announce the United States will seek election to the Human Rights Council for the 2022 to 24 term," end quote. Earlier this year, Blinken said that, quote, "To address the council's deficiencies and ensure it lives up to its mandate, the United States must be at the table using the full weight of our diplomatic leadership," end quote. Currently, the membership includes China, Russia, and Venezuela, along with Cuba, Cameroon, Eritrea, and the Philippines. The full weight of our diplomatic leadership, we backed out of it. I mean, admittedly, a lot of this stuff is going to get chalked up to Trump having been in charge and pulling us out of it, but that's also a blow to America. It's a blow to the full weight of our diplomatic leadership. And I can't help but wondering if what he's talking about with the deficiencies is the membership of these other countries, but we'll see about that. In international news, Amnesty International has stripped Alexei Navalny of his prisoner of conscience status after they received many complaints highlighting xenophobic comments that Navalny has made in the past and not renounced. Some of the calls quoted a Twitter thread by Katya Kazbek, a freelance columnist. She reposted Navalny's controversial videos after his arrest in January, describing him as an avowed racist and accusing supporters of whitewashing his nationalism. Amnesty spokesman Alexander Artemev explained, quote, "Navalny has not publicly denounced his YouTube videos, so our idea is that somehow he can relate to what he said," end quote. In January, Amnesty International decried Navalny's arrest as further evidence the Russian authorities are seeking to silence him, quote unquote, and called for his immediate and unconditional release. The organization says that it will continue with those calls and to, quote, "do everything we can to reach that goal," end quote. Britain on Tuesday granted the European Union 2 extra months to approve their bilateral trade deal that sets out relations in the wake of Brexit. The deal was set to be fully signed and sealed by both sides by the end of this month, but the EU asked for an extension. The agreement was struck on Christmas Eve last year, just a week before the Brexit transition period expired. Britain's parliament approved it in late December. A statement on it from the British government reads, quote, "It is disappointing the EU has not completed its internal processes in the agreed timeframe, given the uncertainty it creates for businesses and individually on both sides," end quote. In Germany, a court on Wednesday sentenced an Iraqi preacher to more than 10 years in prison for planning an attack on Germany and collecting funding and doing recruitment for the Islamic State. Prosecutors accused him of recruiting at least 7 individuals, including 2 who are believed to have killed over 150 Iraqi soldiers in suicide bombings. He was sentenced to 10.5 years in prison, while some of the men he recruited were sentenced to between 4 and 8 years in prison. In the country of Niger, Mohamed Bazoum has won the presidential election, which has been hailed as the first democratic transition in that country. He took 55.75% of the vote against opposition candidate Mohamed Ousmane. Supporters of Mr. Ousmane, a former president, have protested in the streets, alleging fraud. Bazoum is set to succeed President Mahamadou Issoufou, who is stepping down after 2 5-year terms. In the country of Georgia, thousands of anti-government protesters rallied outside the parliament building in central Tbilisi on Tuesday after the arrest of opposition leader Nika Melia. Protesters gathered to denounce Melia's arrest and demand early elections. Georgia has been in the grip of a political crisis since parliamentary elections in October, which opposition parties slammed as rigged after the Georgian Dream Party claimed a narrow victory. Irakli Kobakidze, chairman of the ruling Georgian Dream Party, has defended the police raid, stating, quote, "Polarization is a result of criminals being in politics, not of so-called politicians being in jail," end quote. Georgia's new prime minister, Irakli Garibashvili, names. I'm an American. I'm a dumb American who has a hard time with names sometimes. Anyway, Georgia's new prime minister, who was confirmed by parliament on Monday, has said in a statement to lawmakers that Malia will, quote, not manage to hide from justice, end quote. The U.S. Embassy in Georgia has stated that it was, quote, deeply concerned by the government's decision to detain the head of a major opposition political party, end quote. In tech news, Twitter has added a hacked materials warning to some tweets, warning about their contents that, quote, these materials may have been obtained through hacking. By the way, this label, as far as I can tell, was first applied to a Gray Zone article that we're going to be talking about in just a few minutes. So there you go. Leaked files, specifically from the Gray Zone, leaked files showing Reuters and the BBC's role in covert British Foreign Office programs to affect attitudinal change and weaken the Russian state's influence, quote, end quote, joined by intel contractors and outlets like Bellingcat. Again, as far as I can tell, the first time that this label has been used against the Gray Zone, major factual good outlet we reference frequently. We've had their guests, the founders of the network, we've had them on as guests before, and hopefully will again soon. And when users went to try to share tweets with these, they were given a warning, basically telling them, hey, do you actually want to do this? These are hacked. These tweets contain hacked content. It's just interesting. It's just, Twitter is adding a variety of warnings. And while this is not misinformation, Twitter is not technically claiming that it's misinformation, but they're warning them that, they may have been obtained through hacking. And specifically, they want people to help keep Twitter a place for reliable info. But is hacked info necessarily unreliable? I mean, isn't it in some sense, if you're getting it from the source, more reliable than the higher level reporting that people do on rumors of what's going on? Anyway, don't mean to make too much ado about that. We've got to close our headlines here, actually. We got more headlines to get to, but we'll have to come back to those later. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be coming back in just a minute with our next guest, Andrew Spanis, talking about the collapse and reformation of the Italian government under Mario Draghi. You're listening to Fault Lines. We'll be right back on the other side of this short break.
Fault Lines. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We give you the most essential information out there. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
What do we want?
News, politics, and culture.
When do we want it?
Wait, we weren't finished. News, politics, and culture without the red and blue spin.
Okay, so now when do you want it?
Daily from noon to 2 p.m. Eastern Time.
Okay, satisfied now?
Never. Tune into Political Misfits on 105.5 FM in Washington, D.C. and on 102.9 and 104.7 FM in Kansas City, Missouri. Daily for our analytical fix. Don't surrender.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we're talking about Italy. Italy, a country that has long faced various economic crises, was first hit hardest by the COVID crisis, has faced over the past couple of years increasingly frayed political institutions. Within the past couple of weeks, the government has undergone a dramatic reformation, with former European Bank Chairman Mario Draghi now taking place as Italy's prime minister. To follow up on this, we were having a conversation before this happened a couple of weeks ago with guest Andrew Spanis. We're having him back on now. He's an American journalist and writer based in Italy. You can follow Andrew on Twitter at Andrew Spanis and read his website at transatlantico.info. Andrew, thank you for joining us. How are you doing this morning? I believe you may be muted, good sir. Can't hear you. You have yourself... Oh, he dropped. Oh, man, we're in the process of bringing him back on. Sometimes, he's international. Sometimes you have a little bit of difficulty bringing folks on.
Yeah, he'll be back.
What I'm curious about, he will be back very shortly. What I'm curious about is, okay, Andrew, do we have you with us?
Yes, I'm here.
Beautiful. Thank you for joining us. I initially said good morning, and then I realized a minute after, it's actually probably afternoon. So good afternoon. How are you doing?
Fine. Yeah, it's about 3:15 here, so doing fine. Starting to get a little spring here in Italy, but we're also starting to get rising virus caseloads. So Italy is one of the few countries that's not very much locked down in Europe right now, but we're heading that way again.
That's not good to hear. And this is as things are warming up, which is a bit surprising because across, of course, much of the rest of the world, cold and flu season is in the past. We're sort of exiting it at this point, and so cases have been dropping pretty significantly in the US. Let's get to Italian politics, though. Mario Draghi, now Italy's prime minister, served as the president of the European Central Bank from 2011 until 2019. I want to set the conversation up like this. I'm curious. With him as the European Central Bank president, and with Italy as one of a few nations in Europe that have gone through serious economic tumult, largely due to interactions with the European Central Bank, what's his reception at home? How do people feel about him? What's his popularity rating at this point? What are his plans? But just sort of setting this up for people, it seems like there's, if not a conflict of interest, at least a conflict politically that could lead to him being a pretty unpopular prime minister. But Andrew, what are you seeing?
Well, right now, Draghi is actually very popular, and he's seen as a savior. Now, the reason for this is that people tend to forget a bit about his role in creating the problems for Italy from 2011 on in particular, although he has a long history. He was part of the group that really pushed privatization, liberalization in the 1990s. But from 2011 on, he was at the European Central Bank. He was one of the voices, together with other EU officials and the IMF, calling for harsh austerity in Italy. And they got it, and that hurt Italy a great deal. But he also did something else, which is that he used the ECB, European Central Bank, to buy state bonds on the market. And that helped bring down interest rates on Italian bonds. And this was seen as extremely helpful because Italy has large public debt. So you had investment funds buying up bonds on the market and putting pressure on Italy. Italy, whenever there's a political crisis, they would have to pay more in terms of interest. So Draghi used the ECB, the power of the ECB, to bring down interest rates on public debt, not just for Italy, but for other countries as well. So for this, he's seen as somewhat of a hero by some people here, and he's also seen as technically competent. But that doesn't mean it'll last too long. We'll see.
Wow, competent, and you don't think it's going to last too long. So he is getting, if I'm not mistaken, the support of the Five Star Movement. And that is one of the largest political parties that is in Italy at this point. These guys, and correct me if I'm wrong, were Eurosceptics at one point. And the idea that they're joining with Draghi, what has inspired this level of popularity with Draghi at this point? Is it just because he's the only one that can form the government? Is that where this is going?
Well, there's two things to say here. Why is he popular? He's popular because he's been presented as this above the fray figure who's very credible internationally, right? So he's seen as very credible with other European countries. So this makes him popular for among Italians in particular because the past government was not that credible, and part of this is because of the Five Star Movement, which brought a lot of people who had never been in politics, brought them into the institutions. But the Five Star Movement has made a complete change. I mean, but they made it beforehand too. As soon as they got into government, they essentially started walking back their position. They were calling for a referendum on leaving the euro, single currency, and which is total opposite of what Draghi's positions were. He was trying to save it as much as possible. So they've totally changed that, and they've remained and they've kept some of their positions, anti-corruption, environmentalism, but for the most part, their anti-establishment positions have been watered down tremendously, and they just don't want to be kicked out of power. They've become institutionalized. And the League, the other populist party that was in government with the Five Star Movement, but it's more a right-wing party, they've done a similar thing. Their rhetoric hasn't changed as much, but they are also supporting the government after being heavy, harsh critics of the European Union. So basically, the parties were put with their backs up against the wall, saying if you don't accept Draghi, there's going to be a crisis for Italy, a financial crisis. There will be a speculative attacks on the country. So you got to accept him, and almost everyone's supporting him.
That looks like they would destroy the credibility of the parties. I mean, I remember in Greece where I think it was Syriza, And the entire country, they did a referendum. I think it was like 60% basically said to tell Germany, go F themselves in no uncertain terms. And what it ended up happening was basically it didn't matter. They were knuckle under just based on the pressure associated with it, with Syriza basically losing confidence and for that matter, losing credibility. Wouldn't that be something similar in this situation where, because I don't think the Eurosceptics in Italy have gone anywhere from the standpoint of the audience and from the standpoint of the public itself. So wouldn't that destroy the credibility of those parties? Meaning, in trying to stay in power, looks like on some level they will be depowered.
Well, this is what has changed. What has changed is that the parties that were Eurosceptics have realized that the permanent institutions, that is what's called the president of the republic here, he's the head of state, not the prime minister who's the political leader, but the president of the republic, who's supposed to be an institutional figurehead position, but he's actually very powerful. It was his decision to choose Draghi. And Draghi wasn't elected by anybody. He just appointed him and said, I hope you can get a majority in parliament. He could have called new elections. And the Constitution actually suggested in this situation he should call new elections, but he didn't. He said, there's a crisis, so I'm gonna choose this guy. What has changed is that parties realized that the permanent institutions, the President of the Republic and other European countries like Germany and France, were not going to allow them to govern. So basically, they were kept out. So whereas in the United States, you had Donald Trump ran against the establishment, won the election in 2016, and he was able to govern. And then there was all sorts of fights about what he could do or not do. In Europe, in Italy in particular, what happened is they got into government, but they weren't allowed to carry out any of their policies. And they realized they had to change if they want to govern. At least that's the way they've seen it. Now, what does this mean for their popularity? The Five-Star Movement is already way down. They had 33% in 2018 in the elections, and they're now down to somewhere around 12 or 13%. So they've lost almost 2/3 of their votes. And that's one of the reasons they don't want to go to new elections, because they get wiped out. So they've already lost their credibility, their populist credibility. The League is the most popular party in the country. It got up to over 30% 2 years ago. It's coming down. And I think that with this government, they're trying to show that they're responsible. Their strategy is, we're going to show we're responsible. And that way, when the next elections come up in 2 years, we can win and we'll be able to go into government and they won't block us anymore. I'm not sure it's going to work, because there's one right-wing party which has stayed out of the government, and they're probably going to benefit from this when this government becomes unpopular.
Real quick question. This is probably just my confusion, but looking at Italy's parliament right now, Five-Star Movement has 35.5, call it 35% of the seats in the Senate and about 36% in the Chamber of Deputies. When you're talking about those 12, 13% figures, those low figures, what are you talking about?
Talking about their polls right now. Their polls,
okay, thank you.
Which is also reflect. So the numbers you just mentioned reflect the 33% they got in the elections in 2018, national elections. Since then there have been some regional elections, what would be state parliaments, state legislatures in the U.S. There have been European Parliament elections, and they've come down considerably in those elections. And now the polls, say that they'd be between 10 and 15% if there were general political elections today. So there's going to be a big shift by the time the next elections come around. But the establishment's hope is that these populist parties, one, that they're forced to sort of align themselves, right? And two, if the ones that don't align, that they'll sort of lose their steam by the next time there are new elections, because that's the big thing here, which most people are people talk about it, but not quite that much. The fact is, the choice was made not to have elections. The scary thing, and it's said explicitly by some people on the left, we can't have elections because the right might win. So if you think these people are unacceptable, and it's mostly they're unacceptable because they're critical of the European Union. That's been the thing. So you're not allowed to win the elections if you're critical of the European Union. So that's there's a democracy problem here. There's a democracy. The decision has been made. If you're critical of the overall direction of the EU, then we're going to keep you out of power no matter what. Which I think is actually a mistake, though. I think they need to. I hear you. Right.
No, Andrew, I'm sorry for cutting away. We've only got a couple of minutes, and I want to make sure we get to what's coming in the future. What do you see Draghi's policies being? What has he already proposed? What kind of government do you think he's going to lead here? How is he actually going to change things now that he's prime minister? Andrew?
Well, he says that he's changed. He says that he's not here to impose austerity. He's not here to cut the budget that happened in the past. He says that his goal is investment and rebuilding the Italian economy. So I expect him, and I hope he's a good manager, that he's going to do a good job in dealing with the pandemic, in the next few months, hopefully bringing it down as it comes down with vaccinations. And there's this money to be spent. There's a certain amount of money to be spent to try to rebuild the economy, which is coming from the European Union. It's not really. It's really Italy's own money, but the European Union has given Italy the permission to spend it. So Draghi's going to try to push a lot on innovation, digital transformation, improve the public administration, bureaucracy, schools. So there are areas which need a lot of work. And, we can hope that he'll be efficient in doing this. I'm just worried that it's kind of hard to take the banker pro-privatization neoliberal out of somebody when they're 70 years old. So I'm thinking there's going to be a lot of blood left on the floor, too, when he gets down to reorganizing the economy.
Yeah, there's the quip about teaching an old dog new tricks. And I hear what you're saying. Andrew, we're out of time. Thank you for joining us for this conversation.
You're welcome. See you again next time.
See you next time. For those listening, that was Andrew Spanis, American journalist and writer based in Italy. You can follow him on Twitter at Andrew Spanis and read his website, transatlantico.info. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a minute with our next guest, Piers Robinson. Be right back.
Fault lines. Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Great shot. Even better. Let's get one more, just to be sure.
Are you a young photographer the world needs to know? Bring your images to more eyes through the Andre Stenin contest. Open to both artists and photojournalists, there are dozens of categories to enter and compete for a share of serious prize money. And, more importantly, international recognition of your work. Learn more about how to enter at stenincontest.com. Point, shoot, win.
Fault lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. We had the opportunity to talk about leaks. And one of the interesting leaks that have taken place that Twitter is, oddly enough, putting a sticker on it, and despite the fact that it wasn't putting a sticker on other quote-unquote leaks, the Gray Zone has basically come out with somewhat of a shocking story that you would think would be covered far more in regards to mainstream media. Two of the largest and most trusted media organizations have been rocked by leaked documents indicating that Reuters and the BBC were sponsored by the UK Foreign and Commonwealth Office to conduct a series of covert programs aimed at promoting regime change inside Russia and undermining its governments across Central Asia. The leaks show Reuters Foundation and the BBC that were participating in covert welfare campaign aimed at countering Russia, working through shadowy department within the UK FCO known as the Counter Disinformation and Media Development. The media contractors and secret entity known simply as the Consortium. Basically, and this is quote, through training programs of Russian journalists overseen by Reuters, the British Foreign Office sought to produce an attitudinal change in participants, promoting a positive impact on their perception of the UK. Going so far as to basically handhold and give these guys instruction on how to go about their particular affairs and the attitude to take towards Russia. They have 400 people in Russia, apparently, that have been working alongside this program. To discuss, we're joined by Dr. Piers Robinson, political scientist and co-director of the Organization for Propaganda Studies. Dr. Robinson, welcome to the show.
Good morning.
So this is a great story. to discuss in regards to propaganda studies. I mean, basically, Reuters and the BBC, if the gray zone is right and if the leaked documents are correct, well, Reuters and the BBC were basically working at the behest of the state. Now, they wouldn't categorize it as that, but if you're taking money from the state for a political disposition that drops context and creates a, let's say, Western perspective in the various countries and try to create attitudinal changes and kind of combat Russia in many of these countries, well, it seems that you're working at the behest of the state, and it looks like you're a state propaganda outlet. Now, what am I wrong? How am I wrong in this assessment here? I mean, these guys are getting, and it's more insidious than that, because they're paid, or they're going with this perception of independent journalists, meaning that the point of view that these guys are given is more trusted because there's no entanglements around them. And that is found to be lacking. What are your thoughts on this very specific point? This is literally propaganda, correct?
Well, I mean, this new information which has come out and these stories which are being reported by the Grey Zone and also, I think, by Kit Klarenberg as well through Sputnik, what this points towards is the broader thesis or broader argument that's been in place for many, many years now, decades, in fact, that the political positioning of mainstream media in Western democracies is much closer to government and economic power than is held to be the case. It's always promoted throughout Western political culture that our media is independent, that it challenges government and so on. But we've known for a long time now, and there's a vast swathe of critical political communication scholarship going back to the 50s, 60s, 70s, consolidated in some ways by Herman and Chomsky in their propaganda model in the 80s, which really made very, very clear that all of the evidence shows that mainstream media organizations operate in a way that they're not genuinely fully independent of political power. And some of the reasons for this are, in a sense, somewhat, not benign, but obvious in the sense that mainstream journalists become very reliant upon official sources when constructing the news. And at a domestic level, that tends to be less of an issue than it is when it comes to foreign policy, when there's less, as it were, diversity of views going to journalists in relation to foreign policy issues. And so what the media tends to do is just fall into line with government narratives over international political issues. And this has been known for a very long time, and it's for a variety of reasons that the media is not independent, that it is, effectively, as you suggested, can very easily be caught up in propaganda operations being run by governments. What these latest leaks sort of point towards, and they come on top of several years' worth of leaks. There was leaks into what's known as the Integrity Initiative, which showed this very concerted drive to try to co-opt elements from the academy, from academia, elements from media.
Corbyn. I mean, this was an element of the British government that was basically attacking the leader of the opposition under the guise of, quote unquote, stopping Russian disinformation. I mean, that's
correct. That's correct. And so what this looks is you have sort of a degree of organization which is much more extreme than we've seen sort of perhaps in earlier decades. This sort of kind of almost this outsourcing of propaganda operations through to contractors. And then as these documents indicate, the co-optation and cooperation with major media organizations. And yes, the answer to your question is correct. What this means is that the mainstream media, probably more today than ever before in Western history, gets caught up in the propaganda campaigns being pushed by governments. And I think that's the reality of the situation that we find ourselves in now, that mainstream media has become more than ever an arm of government and an arm of foreign policy in the way that it reports.
I want to come at this from a slightly different angle. We talk about this stuff consistently on this show. I think we're at the head of the pack in indicting media bias where we see it because it's so endemic and frankly, it's pretty easy to do. I'm curious though, from your perspective, admittedly coming at this from a more academic one, not as a journalist talking about this stuff, although you've done some work on that we've talked about. How do you think this is playing out? If people in the newsrooms, if the editors or the writers, if the members of the staff at an organization like, for instance, the BBC or Reuters, if they're seeing this stuff, which itself may be doubtful in many cases, how do you think they're responding? Is there any real potential for these organizations to reform themselves from internal dissent and, the circulation of internal memos, that kind of thing about what's going on here and standing up to this resistance? Or do you think they're just bought into it? They're getting their paycheck and they're satisfied. Admittedly, this would be speculation for you, but I'm curious, propaganda is your thing in some sense, looking into it, making sure to counter it where you can. Is there a potential for the journalistic establishment to reform itself? Piers.
There's always the possibility that people within these organizations look at their own sort of sense of professionalism and objectivity and think of ways in which they might try to challenge what's going on. There's always that possibility. However, if you look at the dynamics of the media industry over the last 20 years, you've got newsrooms, you've got greater job insecurity than ever before for journalists, and you have all of those pressures coming to bear, less resources for investigative journalism, kind of rising journalism is one phrase a political communication scholar used, this kind of churning out of official press briefings. What all of that means, I think the space for autonomy and the space to challenge is very much diminished. And it's always interesting to draw a parallel with the Vietnam War. At a certain point in the Vietnam War, you had journalists such as Walter Cronkite, Seymour Hersh, really starting to challenge and question that conflict. And they did that on off the back of, or in the context of, probably a greater sort of degree of autonomy within the mainstream media than exists today. There was some kind of protection, some kind of confidence that they felt that they could do those things. So Walter Cronkite felt when during a Tet Offensive that he could editorialize and say America's stuck in a quagmire, etc. Seymour Hersh had the confidence to sort of expose the My Lai massacre in Vietnam. And I'm not sure whether there is any of that left in mainstream newsrooms. What we have seen over the last 20 years, scandal after scandal in terms of international politics, Iraq, and then you move through to Syria, and of course the current OPCW controversy, which most of the mainstream media, not all, but nearly all of it, are just refusing to touch. A volume of evidence which shows that there was distortion of the investigation of that alleged chemical weapon attack in Syria. And so I think that the pressures in the news industry are just so great now that there's almost no hope, I think, of reform within the media. I think the pressure can only come from members of the public, from alternative media, independent media, pressuring these organizations to start to do a better job. And, we are at a point where historically trust levels in the mainstream media are extremely low. In America, I think it's gone from 70% trusting sort of mainstream network news down to about 30%. And I think those figures are correct. But it's the same across the board in West. More people than ever before do not trust the mainstream media, and frankly, for very good reasons. And I think that pressure might start to come to bear, and also the tendency of people to seek out alternative sources might increase the pressure. But I don't think it will get away from the fundamental problem we have with the kind of structures and organizations. And also, as we see with these leaks, the extent to which media organizations seem to be willing to get actively involved in promoting essentially geopolitical narratives. Want them to push. The mainstream media is very much broken, and I see very little reason to think that they will change or come from within, from sort of courageous journalists standing up. I think they're far too kowtowed at this point in time for us to see any hope of that happening.
Well, it's very strange because we have Fox News, which is the mouthpiece of the Republican Party, MSNBC, which is the mouthpiece of the Democratic Party, and both of those organizations are basically considered just news shows as opposed to propaganda outlets. the two parties are basically the only two parties that run the state. So if these guys are talking and these are talking as a mouthpiece for the political parties, then I don't see how this is this kind of deviation from state-based politics. More importantly, and I'm going to make the argument here and tell me where do you think I'm wrong, is it possible that soft power of propaganda is necessary in order to maintain the cohesion of a state? And what I mean by that is, I often say reality doesn't care about our ideologies. And at some point, the things that we say we are is going to deviate from what we actually are. And either your country or the organization has to basically deal with that honestly and earnestly, or they have to do what many governments do and bury that information and bury that report and go with the noble lie. I guess what I'm getting at is the noble lie necessary for social cohesion, especially in an imperfect world?
Well, I think that there are certainly people within the establishment, within the elite structures, who do believe in that concept of the noble lie. People should read John Mearsheimer's book, Why Leaders Lie, and you'll see how within the foreign policy community, deception in international politics is seen as necessary. And he makes the point that liberal democracies will often lie about why they're involved in a war because they don't want to tell their public that the war is not a moral one, for example.
Exactly.
And so there is always this rationalization, but this is a rationalization which ultimately benefits powerful groups and enables powerful groups to essentially manipulate publics. And so I think from their point of view, as it were, from the kind of Platonic noble lie, it's in their interest to maintain deceptions and maintain beliefs and things which are not true, so they can maintain stability, etc.
I know, but more importantly, I don't mean to interrupt because we're coming to the end of the segment. But more importantly, is it a basis of liberal democracy? Meaning, how do you escape lying in a liberal democracy? How do you escape the propaganda to push? I mean, we showed Psaki, I think it was a few years ago, where she basically looked into the camera and said, yeah, the United States doesn't involve itself in coups, and somebody saying otherwise is ludicrous. Now, you can, like, this statement is utterly ludicrous, and yet she'll say it with no expectation of pushback, and somebody did push back on her on that front. But I guess I'm making the point, is it just the basis of the democracy itself that operates where it requires that level of propaganda in order to make the country just work, just as the basis of operation?
Well, it needs that level of propaganda to get the country to work in a particular way. But my argument would be, from a liberal democratic point of view, that it means that the country ends up working in a way which isn't in the interests of most of the people. It's working in the interests of powerful groups, big business, etc., big tech, political actors who have vested interests and so on. Propaganda means it works in their interests. And ultimately, in the long run, I don't think it works in the interests of society as a whole, because I think stable societies, ultimately, ones which are genuinely democratic and where you genuinely have a buy-in from the population, etc., that those societies are stronger. They're not only morally or ethically better, they're also politically stronger. And this is why we have one of the reasons why we have a crisis in the West. We've had unprecedented levels of deception coming from governments over a whole range of foreign policy issues for a long time. And this has eroded trust and eroded faith within the political system. And that's why one of the reasons why I think where we are today with the sort of political chaos that we see, this is chickens, it's coming home to roost now. This is the level of deception we've seen.
No, 1,000% agree. We would be a stronger country if it was honest. I mean, but it's like, can't be honest, hence, because of, we're not necessarily being clean, working with clean hands. Dr. Pierce Robinson, thank you for joining us, man. I really do appreciate this conversation. Dr. Pierce Robinson is political scientist and co-director of the Organization for Propaganda Studies. You can follow Dr. Robinson on Twitter at PierceRobinson1 and his blog, piercerobinson.wordpress.com. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back taking your calls, 202-521-1320, with The Wrap.
Fault Lines.
In a media landscape filled with so-called journalists acting as stenographers for their billionaire bosses, there is a desperate need for news, analysis, and perspectives that buck the status quo and get to the heart of how domestic and international events impact you and me, as well as showing how we can get involved in the struggle to change that status quo. Check out By Any Means Necessary on Radio Sputnik, Monday through Friday from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern, to hear the stories and voices that mainstream media refuses to tell you. And join us as we connect the political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us. That's By Any Means Necessary, Monday through Friday at 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern, right here on Radio Sputnik.
Fault lines.
And we are back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we are taking your calls, 202-521-1320. If we've got time for it, I want to come back to what we were just talking about with Dr. Pierce Robinson. What he was saying at the end there sparked a lot of thoughts. It had been a while since I'd thought, to be honest. I was on this train of thought a while back, and I want to come back to it if we have time, because there's a lot more to talk about there on every angle. But we got callers, and we're taking more, 202-521-1320. We've got Tarif calling in from New Orleans. Tarif, you are on the line. What is on your mind?
Yeah, I got to keep Julian Assange in our prayers and keeping his name out there. Free Julian Assange. We got to, back him to get him freed. Thank God somebody in Australia, a political person, all these years kept silent, came out, I forgot his name, to support Julian Assange to free him.
You know, it's wild, Tarif. He is basically in limbo. Think about that. Because the charges, it was 50 weeks? That went up. So, and then they just kept him in prison afterwards. And then the judge comes back and says, yeah, we're not going to ship you to the American jail, but we're going to keep you here in our jail. That's living in the beach, right? You know what I mean? He's in limbo. It's very strange. I mean, by definition, he's a political prisoner. So, yeah, I feel you on this one. So definitely keep his name up. In the atmosphere.
And the name I think the Australian politician you're talking about, that's Anthony Albanese. Just if people are curious, if you wanted to look into that, there's news coming out in the past couple of days because he is standing up in support of Julian Assange. Anyway, Tarif, I don't think that was your last comment. Were you going to continue?
Oh, yes. Right now, our country is very polarized on both sides. Trump let the neocons in, he let them pull them all the way to the right. And Joe Biden, he's already done with the neoliberals. So this country is based off these party systems instead of the country system, dealing with the Constitution, human rights, and civil rights for the well-being of the public by reading the Constitution correctly. So this country is becoming a DNC and GOP battlefield between neocon and neoliberal, which both parties is war hawks. So we got to get from the party system, go back to the American traditional system, and advance the Constitution, advance human rights and civil rights. We won't be in a situation when you have a news reporter and whistleblowers that have to leave the country because they're afraid they're going to be thrown in jail like Jeffrey Sterling and Julian Assange. So we got to go back to the mother roots of freedom of speech and protecting human rights, civil rights. That's all I want to say.
Tarif, thank you for the call. We are taking more calls too, 202-521-1320. While we've got time, please do call in. We got a lot of room for more calls, and we want to hear from you. With the propaganda stuff, I think a lot of this started out, I'll be honest, the different degrees of propaganda. Obviously, governments have lied throughout history. The noble lie, that idea is, 2,400 years approximately old at this point. That's not a new idea. So this is, in some sense, as old as much older than any extant political system. But I would say that the modern field of propaganda got launched in the early 20th century, where if you look at, for instance, Edward Bernays in his book Crystallizing Public Opinion, 1923, he was laying out very clearly what propaganda is. In a democracy, you have a variety of opinions running amok. Governments have interests, and you need to crystallize public opinion on certain issues in order to maintain stability and to get what you want done in the government. Now, he's, coming out. This is obviously before the advent of television, early days of radio. The Nazis certainly took radio to heart along with FDR here in the States in order to get their public opinion across.
That's the other part, social cohesion, not just like It's changing the public's point of view. I mean, Operation Mockingbird was like this, right? Where the CIA was seeing that they could change people's point of view by paying professors and people who are movers and shakers in society and whatnot. And yeah, in this very specific case, media is a weapon. And social cohesion, in lieu of blunt force, let's say of dictators, becomes an element in the toolkit. So that's why I kept asking, or that's why I was asking whether it's a basis of democracy, meaning it's not a bug, it's a feature. It's something that is required just by operation of the democracy in and of itself. I'm beginning to think that the answer is yes. Yeah.
Well, that's it. Again, this is maybe the third or fourth time that I brought this up as host of the show, one of the two hosts of the show. With manufacturing consent, one of Chomsky's arguments is that democracy is, that propaganda is to a democracy what the cudgel is to a totalitarian state. You need propaganda in order to, like you say, maintain social cohesion. You need to bring people together. But you don't just bring them together, you bring them together by and large in support of what you want to get accomplished. And that's where what can be seen as an unmitigated good social cohesion, the amity of all instead of the enmity of each against each, becomes a tool for pursuing whatever the oligarchy that's in charge wants at that time. That's what it inevitably becomes. And that's why, I call for unity. I want unity around some new, better status quo, some new, better way of doing things. If it were merely calling for unity, what's up?
What if it wasn't oligarchs? Like, what if, let's say Sanders got in office, and let's say it was a generation of, kind of like the FDR thing like that. Is it still a feature of the politics? And I got to be honest, I think it still is. Like when you go out and you make the speech for why you want to give Social Security and increase it. Yes, you can give a specific statement, but your enemies are going to attack you on it in a particular way that may be disingenuous, that forces you to take a position that is more boisterous than you would typically take. Take Obamacare, for example. When Obamacare was passed, 26 million people still was without health care, something like that, give or take. But they screamed that it was universal health care because Republicans were attacking it viciously. You see what I mean? Like, and I know that's Obamacare. It's not necessarily a great program. But if it was Medicare for all, there would be vagaries in the program because, again, reality doesn't care about your ideology. And so what does Sanders say? How do you defend the vagaries of something that you know is overall good? And do you resort to a certain degree of propaganda, even if it's soft propaganda, in order to make your point clear? Like, I'm beginning to think it's just an aspect of government in general. Like, go back to the earliest tribe, and the guy will probably be there, overstating. So, how the rock was made into a hammer or something.
But rhetoric is not propaganda. We are constantly awash in an ocean of public opinion. But propaganda is like the hydraulic dam of whatever. It's a coordinated, engineered effort to change the flow of those waters. It's a bit of a stretched metaphor, but I think you get what I'm saying. And what I'm worried about is not rhetoric, because rhetoric is human. You like you say, you overstate things, you're boisterous, you add some emotion. If we're not the Borg. To use the Star Trek reference, we don't just run on logic, and we don't just immediately run on a sort of herd-based, collective, non-instinctual shared understanding. You get what I'm saying? You overstate things, but that's just human. That's just human behavior. Propaganda, I would say, is like artificial, and it's kind of philosophical. And I don't want to get lost there, but I would say that by and large is not good. Pretty much I'll put it like this: I don't hear anybody using the term propaganda in a positive light. People use propaganda to describe whatever form of communication they don't like. And it's self-understandable. I don't know that that's healthy. I think that we should, what is propaganda? It is a coordinated effort, an engineered effort by some establishment to try to advocate a specific narrative in opposition to what other people might want. And therefore it's a lie. You're creating a context, you're hiding the other context, and the fact that it's engineered means that it's not just rhetoric, means it's not just communication. And we're washing up more than ever these days. We're dealing with it more than we ever have. And while QAnon, in my opinion, is ridiculous, admittedly a hard turn, while QAnon, in my opinion, is insane, what sparked QAnon? It was what we were just talking about with Dr. Pierce Robinson. It is distrust in the media establishment. It's distrust in the media that's engendered by the fact that for about a century now, at the very least, we have been awash in attempts to control what we think and to control what we're able to say, et cetera. With Twitter blocking accounts and blocking tweets from people who are saying things they don't like, people talk about politically correct speech. This is kind of in vogue in the 90s and it's kind of faded now. That is the definition, literally, of politically correct speech. If you were only allowed to say what the political establishment wants you to say, that is politically correct speech in a sort of technical, tautological sense. And we need to be very careful to make sure that we allow for politically incorrect speech in exactly that technical sense. We need people to be able to say things that are critical of the political system, because otherwise, like Piers was saying, what you get is a bubble, a media bubble, that is to the detriment of the state that you're in. It destabilizes things in the long run. In the short run, it might be a useful tool for getting what you want done. But in the long run, people don't trust you. They don't trust each other. They start to hate you and each other. And it leads to the decline of your system. And that's what we're living through right now. Jamarl, we got to go out here in a minute, but any last comments on this?
Yeah, just as a quick comment. Yeah, to piggyback on what you and Piers were saying. It wasn't the Alex Jones that caused that stuff to go down. It wasn't the Russians that caused it to go down. It was their failures. I mean, the Iraq War, the Syria thing, Russiagate, all of these things were huge failures that no accounting for. So that's where I would put the problem, not on this other stuff. So I agree with you.
Yeah, and again, part of the problem with villainizing a large section of the American public, like Congress, I think, is trying to do more and more after January 6th, is that you don't address the real underlying problem, which is your own lack of credibility. That's what's really at fault here, and we need to fix that stuff. And we are doing that right here on Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik every Monday through Friday. Thank you, everybody, for listening. Thank you to our producers, Cameron and Raheem. Thank you to engineer Andre. Thank you to all of our guests. And thank you, Jamarl Thomas, my co-host. Oh, and last but definitely not least, thank you again for listening to the show. We'll be back tomorrow, folks. Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Signing off. We'll see you again in the morning.
Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Another one is in the record books. Really interesting show today. We had to start on the fly with Laith and with Alexander McCurris. So shout out to them for coming on the show. Alexander McCurris, always a great guest. Gotta be honest, I could sit there and talk to Alex McCurris for like 2 hours. Still be perfectly okay, just hamming it up. Talking about British politics or European politics. The guy is quite knowledgeable about all that stuff, all sorts of things. The first interview with Laith, I wanted to get into the temporary deal between the IAEA and Iran, but it ended up going more so into basically the hypocrisy of, hey, the rapporteur on assassinations caring greatly about the airplane that they shot down, but caring nothing about the fact that Soleimani was murdered, and that assassination precipitating basically the attacks that knocked that plane down. He made an argument that I couldn't substantiate, which is the reason why I took the extra time to kind of make the point. This is, well, that's your position, or that's Iran's position, because Iran has every reason in the world to take that position, because that position at the very least points to and indicates that shooting down the plane wasn't their fault entirely, but it was also Western powers, either U.S. or somebody else's fault, in regards to hacking their system or damaging their system in a way where they couldn't identify that plane from a fighter coming in to basically attack them. So it makes all the sense in the world that they would take that position. But I don't know that. I remember this case happening. There were two videos. There were two rockets that a security camera caught. One hits the plane, knocking out the transponder that it's believed, and the second one takes the plane or limps it along, where it gets to the point where it either blows up or crashes. I don't remember which one. But the video camera basically had its sights on it as it went on. And look, I don't know how Iran is substantiating their position on this. And so it's unclear to me. What I do know is the video was pretty straightforward. If that means that, some of the mapping thing took place where it called, fair enough. But I don't have that evidence. I don't have that evidence of knowing. And it really did seem like many of the people were working backwards from the logic that this is not a mistake that we'd make. And because that's not a mistake we'd make, that had been something that interfered in order to help us or to push us into that particular mistake. I don't know. I mean, when Israel piggybacked behind the Russian plane, and their plane got shut down with those people basically dying on the plane. Well, isn't that something similar in regards to the way that these guys were operating? Israel didn't necessarily face any consequences. When America shot down Iran's plan, George Bush went out and said, I'm not apologizing for America. I'm not the apologize for America kind of guy, despite the fact that they killed everybody on that plane. I guess what I'm asking for is a level of parity, a level of honesty and context. When you're looking at a story like this, it is necessary and it behooves you to know the other instances where we weren't going to tolerate any kind of charges being brought against our people for stuff like that. Very clear, not apologizing for those actions. Hell, Obama went to Japan and did he apologize? I don't remember if he apologized. Nobody apologized for toppling government, none of that stuff. We don't apologize for that stuff. But it just seems, dodgy that they will point to one and completely ignore the other. And even though I know the scale of the other is monstrous, the insipid factor matters. By the same token, I had to intercede on that conversation because I didn't necessarily know whether what he's saying was true. And if I'm being honest, it could be, even though we push back against propaganda and everything else, it could be propaganda coming from Iran that they don't necessarily want to accept the consequences of that as being a mistake on their own. So that's the reason why that came in. The next interview on the Uyghurs. So the Uyghurs is another interesting one. I would love for them to send me to Xinjiang in order to get a clear story on it. The reason I say I would love to go because A, I love to travel. B, I've always wanted to go to Japan. And C, I am the fucking integrity. And I would give an honest accounting of what I see there. I would get to talk to the various people, talk to the Uyghurs, and get some kind of clue on what's going on, and I would report it honestly. As it stands, we are in a weird Cold War with China. And that war, on some level, was instigated by us recognizing that they're going to become a military power and that their economic might and industrial might will transfer and can translate into military power. They also know that China is strong enough that they're not trying to have an empire. They're basically setting up a strong point where they can defend their border and their lands from attack. Meaning, if the U.S. is going to have to transport all the military and personnel and all this other stuff in order to get over there for attack, we are probably going to lose that engagement. And honestly, even if it wasn't losing engagement, it would most likely end up in a nuclear war. Even if people are like, we're going to use baby nukes, it will most likely end up into a nuclear war because neither country is going to allow themselves to be toppled. And China, it is ingrained in them, based on the humiliation that they suffered at the hands of the West, to never let that happen again. And I would say that digs every bit as deep as them, as black and white and slavery and all those things digging to us. I don't know. And because the West has been very aggressive in pushing this, I am very skeptical of what the West is pushing. That's all. That's where that comes from. And so I can accept that China is putting these people in re-education camps. Fair enough. I can accept that on some level, depending upon who they are and how, let's say, vigorous they are in this idea of let's blow shit up or kill people because they don't believe in our God, how whatever that particular situation is and whatever the camp is and how those things meld together, I don't entirely know. But yeah, it does give me pause because, again, I'm in America and we have issues with people trying to brainwash or get into our heads, despite the fact that mainstream media does it every day. Who you are is an aggregation of everything that you encounter. Some stuff on a subconscious level, other stuff on a more overt level. But that stuff does influence. In China's case, we don't know. That's just it. They're calling it genocide. I think it's a loaded word. And on top of them, I mean, just the fact that they're willing to call it genocide like that is problematic. Even if something is going on, that word is so expansive to use. And so, yeah, it gives me pause. It gives me qualms. And oftentimes you would have people who would be very pro-China, in which case they would blow it off. And people who are very against China, in which case they would make it the most important thing ever and call it genocide. And so where do you fall? Where do you find the ground on a situation like that? And how do you find a ground to do this kind of God's point of view, righteous indignation, etc., if you don't entirely know? That's the only point. And so the guest that we have on is trying to get to the bottom of it. And the questions that we ask, they're just honest questions that need to be asked based on what's taking place. When I asked the question about the re-education camps, it's not that I love re-education camps. By the same token, Nazis had to go through some kind of re-education and denazification, as they called it. Well, what about terrorists? What about people who something may start off as a, let's say, an economic thing, but eventually becomes an identity issue of blowing shit up, antagonism to things that aren't necessarily part of the Wahhabism, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. How do you stop that guy from being that guy without a concerted effort by the state to make that guy something different? And while I would imagine there are going to be excesses, there may be even racism in the way that they engage from one another. There may be either dislike or hatred from, who knows? I have no idea. I can conceivably say, potentially, yes. But do I know? No. So we're trying to get more information on it. We're trying to find guests who are subject matter experts where they are directly related to it. Not, I heard this, or not, I saw this, but I was actually there, or I was a part of the institution itself. That's what we're looking for. And so, the next guest was Daniel Lazar, I believe. Lazar is a fascinating case. We typically talk to him about issues of the Constitution, where he basically is like, look, we need a new rewrite, and meaning revolution. So having him to talk about something that wasn't necessarily strictly and explicitly that was great. The Piers Robinson, the professor on propaganda, another great guest. And the reason why we brought him on is because we wanted to hit the story by the gray zone, because the story is mind-blowing. I mean, basically, we're talking about the Reuters and the BBC working with the shadowy agency in the UK government to basically put stories and undermine the Russian government, and not just undermine the Russian government, to change the attitudes and point of view, basically to use media as a weapon. And the point of view that's expressed by media to send those people into various countries, especially in Russia and in Eastern Europe, in order to basically down Russia, to give one negative story after the next with an American or Western context on those stories, and to continuously do that to the point to destabilize the country. These are leaked documents as given this. Twitter might be trying to put something on it, but the documents are apparently legit. Right here, Reuters and the BBC solicited multi-million-dollar contracts to advance the British state's interventionist aims, promising to cultivate Russian journalists through FCO-funded tours and training sessions, establish influence networks in and around Russia, and to promote NATO or pro-NATO narratives in Russia-speaking regions. NATO in Russian-speaking regions. NATO was supposed to be there to push back against the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union as a political entity no longer exists, and Vladimir Putin is basically a capitalist. That country is basically a capitalist country. They are a country that you can do deals with, and considering we work with Saudi Arabia, that, yeah, you already bottom in the barrel. The point I'm trying to make here is that Reuters and the BBC are two of the largest and most trusted news agencies. And to find out in leaked documents that they are basically working behind the scenes with support from the British government to basically push CIA, MI6 narratives about Russia. Ask me again while I'm skeptical of the conversation that's coming out about China. Ask me again. No, good show today. So I'm going to say like, I'm going to say share, I'm going to say subscribe, and you will be seeing me a little bit later today. Definitely make sure you hit that like button. Thanks all. I'll see you soon.